Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you fall asleep. So before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so leave it in the comments. When you're ready, get comfortable and relax. I'm Liam, and I have a feeling the rain has never let up since that day. The strongest storm I had ever witnessed, as if the whole sky wanted to overflow. The rain was pounding hard on my window pane, over and over again, as if nature itself wanted to warn me of what was coming. There was something unsettling about that storm, something that, as ironic as it was, felt familiar. At first, it all seemed harmless, a simple summer storm. But in truth, it wasn't the storm that haunted me, but something much more terrifying and closer to home. My neighbor, Noah. I met him a few years ago when I first moved into the neighborhood. Noah was one of those quiet guys who didn't bother anyone but always seemed to be watching. At first, I thought he was a peculiar guy, a lonely man like me. We both used to pass each other on the driveway of our respective apartments, a quick hello and nothing more. There was nothing particularly strange at first, but not long after I started noticing odd things. First, it was small, almost imperceptible actions. My apartment door wasn't always locked when I returned from my night jobs. Sometimes, I would find things out of place. A glass on the table that I hadn't set, or the subtle smell of cigarettes in the air when I don't smoke. That's when I began to feel a strange uneasiness, but I ignored it. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, or that something had happened without me noticing. But things got worse, much faster than I imagined. Noah started showing up more often in my life, not in a direct way, but in a more insidious way. He no longer just greeted me in passing. He started leaving little notes under my door, notes that seemed trivial at first, but gradually began to become more strange and disturbing. I saw what you did yesterday. I know you're tired. You should get more sleep. You're worried more than you know. I didn't respond. I thought maybe he was just a neighbor who didn't have much to do. However, that peace of mind began to fade when I started hearing strange noises in my house during the night. At first, I just thought it was the natural sound of old walls, creaks in the building, or rain hitting the roof. But the night started to get more and more disturbing. In the early hours of the morning, I would feel something or someone walking near my door. Soft knocks, as if someone was tapping their fingertips on the wood. No one in my life caused me as much discomfort as those nightly noises, which only seemed to get worse as time went on. That's when Noah started sabotaging my belongings. My car showed up with flat tires several times in a row, and once I found my mail open, with personal letters that clearly shouldn't have been touched. The little signs weren't so little anymore. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Paranoia began to take hold of me. I stopped leaving my apartment for long periods of time. I would check the locks, the windows, everything. I began to watch Noah more closely. There was something in his gaze, a strange emptiness, as if he wasn't really there anymore. His eyes seemed empty, observant. They were not the eyes of a normal person, not of someone who sees life as it is. They were the eyes of someone who had nothing to lose. It all blew up one rainy night, just like that storm. I had come home late from work, exhausted from the day's work. When I entered my apartment, I found the door ajar. My nerves began to race. I thought of possible explanations. Maybe I had forgotten to close the door properly. Maybe a strong wind had moved it. Deep down, however, I was aware that something was not quite right. Something told me that the previous calm had been a false sense of security. I walked in. The apartment was silent, but it was not the comfortable silence I was used to. It was the tense silence, as if someone was waiting in the shadows. I looked around. Everything seemed to be in its place until I saw something on the floor, a letter with my name written at the top. It was a letter I had never seen before, with handwriting I didn't recognize. I bent down to pick it up, and at that moment I heard a noise behind me. As I turned around, I saw Noah's figure in the doorway, his silhouette silhouetted by the dim light of the lamp. There was no warning, no previous signs, just his imposing presence filling the doorway. His face was expressionless, but there was something in his gaze that paralyzed me. I said nothing, but my mind began to scream. It was then that I realized that Noah had crossed a line that could not be turned back. He was inside my home. I was too close. My breathing quickened, sweat began to cover my forehead. The sound of the rain was deafening outside the window, but inside my apartment there was only the sound of my heartbeat. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. Fear had gripped me in such a way that my mind didn't know how to react. Suddenly, I heard the crunch of Noah's footsteps slowly approaching, as if he enjoyed the control, the power he now had over me. It wasn't the fear of what he could do to me that terrified me, but the simple fact that he was there, in my home, in my space, where I thought I was safe. The storm continued outside, but at that moment, everything around me became a blur. The rain was no longer the only one pounding hard. Now it was the anxiety that lashed me, that enveloped me, that made me feel like a prisoner in my own home. My mind was running in circles, looking for a way out, a way to cope, but I knew deep inside that it was too late. I had waited too long to act, to recognize what was happening. And now, he was there, almost touching me. That night, my life changed forever. When the police finally arrived, Noah was already gone. They didn't tell me right away, but I knew it by his empty face, by his empty words. What had started as an obsession, as a game, was no longer an obsession. Now it was something much darker, something that could no longer be stopped. I remember that moment clearly. A feeling of total emptiness came over me when I finally realized the magnitude of what had happened. The hours, the days, the weeks that followed were a long process of adaptation. The fear was still there, constant, and though the days rolled on one after another, the impact of that night never completely faded. The storm outside my window stopped being a rainstorm. It became something else, a storm in my mind, something that could never be completely undone. Today, when I look back, all I can think about is how easy it is to let someone cross a line, how easy it is to ignore the signs until there is no turning back. The lesson I learned is simple, yet painful. You never know how far someone can go. And worst of all, sometimes that person is closer than you imagine. Perhaps the real threat doesn't always come from where you expect it, nor from what you fear. Perhaps the greatest threat is the one that lurks in the shadows closest to you, the one you ignore yourself until it's too late. Because no matter how hard you try, you cannot escape what has already happened. And the echo of that storm continues to resonate. Sometimes we convince ourselves that we can handle any situation, that our lives are ours to decide, to control. We live in an illusion of security. We build walls around us, and we believe that within them we are safe. But the truth is that sometimes the threat is not outside our walls, but just inside them, waiting for the right moment to cross that line that we ourselves have not been able to see. What happened with Noah was not a simple misunderstanding. It was the result of missing the small signs, those that at first seem harmless. Noah's story is, in a way, a warning. Life is not always as simple as it seems, and the people around us are not always who they appear to be. The lesson here is clear. We must pay attention to the signs, not ignore them for fear of seeing what we don't want to see, because when danger is near, it is not always visible to the naked eye. I am Oliver Espinoza. If you asked me to tell you what happened, I would have to tell you that my life was never the same after that year. What started as a simple rumor, something I couldn't even categorize as a threat, turned into a nightmare that haunts me to this day. The fact that I'm telling it now, even after all this time, seems ridiculous. But the truth is that what happened in my home, in my own life, continues to haunt me. And I fear I may never escape it. Fabiana, my wife, was the first thing in my life. We met when we were young, we shared dreams, illusions, until we reached the point of getting married. Everything seemed to fit perfectly, and although like any couple we had our difficulties, we always found a way to overcome them. But there was something that broke between us, something I never knew how to handle. Fabiana told me about him, about Mauro. He was a former lover, a man with whom she had had a relationship before we met. At first, I didn't think that was important. We all have a past, don't we? She assured me that there was no relationship between them. What I didn't know was that sometimes the past isn't as dead as we think it is. The first hint came in the form of a strange message. There was no signature, but the tone was clear. I'm watching you. My first reaction was one of discomfort, but also disbelief. Who could be so interested in us? What reason would anyone have to send such a puzzling message? I let it go, thinking maybe it was a joke from someone who didn't know our circumstances. However, what happened next led me to doubt that explanation. At first, everything was subtle. More messages, more hints. each one more personal than the last. I know exactly what you do when you're not at home. I didn't want to worry Fabiana without concrete proof. I wondered if she knew something more than what she was telling me. Maybe, my mind told me, her past with Mauro had not been as closed as she thought. My anxiety increased to the point that I would start checking every corner of the house, looking for any indication that someone was there, watching. At night, I would close the doors and windows with excessive care, unable to avoid the feeling that someone was lurking. Fabiana looked at me, somewhat surprised by my behavior, but I didn't know how to explain to her what was happening to me. There was something in the air, something I could neither see nor touch, but which was destroying the peace we had built together. After a while, the rumors started to come in. It wasn't something direct, but the comments from acquaintances and friends were starting to become more frequent. "Are you sure everything is okay with Fabiana?" one of my friends asked me in a seemingly casual conversation. "I've heard things." Those words stuck in my mind like a thorn I couldn't get out. What things? What were they talking about? Doubt settled in me with terrifying force. Every time someone said something ambiguous to me about my wife, a shadow of uncertainty spread across my soul. Something wasn't right, and I had no idea what it was. And that's when the facts began to become more concrete. One evening, returning home after a day's work, I found the garage door ajar. I didn't think much of it at first. Perhaps it had been me who had left it open the last time, or Fabiana had simply forgotten to close it. But as I stepped inside, a shiver ran down my spine. That door should not have been left open. Something told me it wasn't a simple oversight. I decided to check the house, going through each room, but everything seemed to be in its place. However, that open door was still present in my mind. Was there someone inside? Someone who had been watching unseen? It was a thought I couldn't let go of. Paranoia began to settle into my life in a way I had never experienced before. Every noise, every shadow, was a potential threat. But worst of all, I had no proof. Only a growing sense that something terrible was coming. The tension increased to the point where my relationship with Fabiana began to crumble. I was forced to watch her constantly, looking for any sign that would confirm my suspicions. And although she noticed my changed attitude, I could not explain to her what I was feeling, what was tearing me apart inside. How could I tell her that I did not trust her? How could I ask her to talk to me about something that perhaps she herself did not understand? Mistrust began to sow in my heart, and it drove me away from the woman I loved. One night, during a fierce storm, what I did not want to admit would happen, happened. Fabiana left in the evening, saying she was going to buy something for dinner. It was a rainy night, the wind whipping the windows hard. I waited anxiously for her, wondering if she was all right, if the storm hadn't delayed her too much. At 10 o'clock at night, I finally saw her arrive, drenched by the rain, with a forced smile. She kissed me on the forehead, but something in her face made me feel that all was not well. She told me she had been late at the store because of the crowd, but something about her attitude struck me as odd. Maybe it was just my restless mind, maybe not. The storm intensified, and the house was silent, too quiet. That's when I heard something I couldn't ignore, a noise in the hallway. I was not alone. It wasn't the wind or the rain. At first I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I heard footsteps, soft but unmistakable. A shiver ran down my spine. Something was not right. Turning my head, I saw him. Mauro. There, in the threshold of the hallway, watching me without expression. His presence was a shadow stretching across the doorframe. I didn't know how he had entered or how many days he had been stalking us. I only knew it was too late to hesitate. Fear paralyzed me. We looked at each other for a few seconds that seemed eternal. The tension in the air was unbearable. His face was impassive, as if everything he had done, everything he had planned, was already in motion. He was not coming to talk. He was not coming to ask questions. He was there with only one intention: destruction. The next part was absolute chaos. Mauro tried to approach, but fear and rage made me react. We struggled, fell to the ground, hands intertwined in a senseless struggle, in an attempt to survive. The floor was wet and slippery, but that didn't stop the fight. Each blow seemed to be the last. Finally, I was able to push him hard against a table, and in that moment of uncontrol, the police arrived. It was enough for Mauro to be arrested, but the damage was done. My life changed forever. After that day, Fabiana and I decided to move out of town. We changed our number, our address, but the fear did not disappear. The echo of that rainy night remained in my mind, like a constant nightmare. And even though the threat disappeared, the damage was done. Physical scars may heal with time, but the mental ones, those persist. The shadows don't fade easily. Sometimes I feel that I still hear those footsteps, that I still feel that strange presence in my house. Today, looking back, I realize something crucial. Danger never comes from where we expect it. The worst nightmares don't always come in the form of shadows or invisible monsters. Sometimes, the worst horrors come in the form of broken people who can't let go of the past, who don't know how to handle rejection, and who drag with them everyone who crosses their path. Mauro was not a specter or a ghost. He was a man shattered by his own inability to accept his defeat. And sometimes, I wonder if the worst of it all is that I wasn't able to see what was really going on until it was too late. The real nightmare does not begin when the shadows become flesh, but when we are unable to recognize the threat until it has already marked us forever. The rain, the echo of his footsteps, the storm, all merged into a single memory, that of a fear that will never disappear completely. The rain was relentless that morning, hitting the windows of the apartment with the fury of a gale. The sound was like an incessant roar that blurred the line between the real and the surreal. I got up as I did every day, feeling the weight of routine on my shoulders. The clock read 6:30 a.m., and the first glow of the day barely filtered through the curtains. Coffee always came first, a habit I had never broken. The aroma of the hot beverage filled the room as I prepared to face what awaited me at the office. I don't know at what point it all broke down, or how I let it go so far. However, when I think about it now, it all started much earlier than I imagined, in the most innocent of moments, in the simplest of moments. A colleague, Henry, had always been there in the same space, working side by side with the others, being the serious guy, almost always quiet, who seemed not to cause discomfort. But his calm was a mask, and I didn't see the crack that hid his anger, his envy. I had grown accustomed to seeing him day after day. Sometimes he didn't pay much attention to small details. That trivial conversation about a project, his look when I was handed a promotion, his way of observing my work with a mixture of admiration and disdain. I thought it was all part of the competitive environment, the struggle to excel. But I was wrong. Sometimes the real poison is not a liquid. It is in the minds, in the plans that are slowly, patiently, and cunningly hatched. That morning, like all the others, I drank my coffee. It was no different from the one I had been drinking for months. Always prepared with the same dedication, with the same ground coffee I bought at the local store. I didn't suspect anything out of the ordinary. My routine was monotonous, almost like a movie that I watched pass by each day without surprise. The coffee warmed my body while the world outside seemed to be crumbling from the storm. The rain wouldn't stop falling, and the sound of thunder rumbled in my chest like a warning, though I didn't know to what. It wasn't until the first spoonful of the liquid entered my throat that something strange happened. A tingle, something different in texture. It was minimal, but enough to alert me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I was rushing to get out, and the effect was so subtle that I decided to ignore it. However, within seconds, the tingling turned into a deep burning, as if my throat was closing up, squeezing tightly. I could not breathe. Desperation began to take over, and I drowned in my own screams as the world faded away. Panic engulfed me completely. I dropped to my knees, struggling for air, but I could not. Weaker and weaker, I felt my body crumbling. I didn't understand what was happening. I knew something was terribly wrong, but confusion consumed me. The light seemed to fade from my vision, and my fumbling hands tried to grasp at something, anything, but I could find no solace in the emptiness that gripped me. It was then that I heard a noise, hurried footsteps, a body approaching me. A face suddenly appeared, but it was unfamiliar. At first, I didn't know if it was a dream, a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen. But the face was clear, the hand that touched me firm. A coworker had arrived in time as soon as he could after hearing my screams, and the last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was his expression of despair. I remember waking up in the hospital. My lungs were full of oxygen and my tired body ached as if it had been brutally beaten. Next to me, the nurse looked at me with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. I could only nod, unable to articulate, as if my throat was still dragging the consequences of the poison I'd consumed. But it was when the report arrived in my office a few days later that the true picture was unmasked. The investigation showed that there were ground nuts in my coffee. A detail that to many might seem trivial, but to me it was the key to everything. I knew I was allergic. I had mentioned it on several occasions, always joking about it. "Watch out for the nuts," I had once said in a laughing tone, unaware that this would be the trigger for something much darker. The report did not mention names, but suspicions were evident. Immediately, I was faced with reality. Henry, that colleague whom I had considered almost invisible, had been the one who had prepared that coffee for me. The poison was not in a strange liquid or a mysterious drug. It was in something that seemed as harmless as a handful of ground nuts, something one could easily find in any kitchen. However, to me, that simple gesture of poisoning me was the first step toward a much more complex conspiracy. Henry had been watching, waiting for the right moment. His motivation was clear: my promotion. He had always been ambitious, but his ambitions had led him into dangerous territory, the realm of desperation. The storm did not cease. The world outside continued to be relentless, as if nature itself was mirroring what was happening in my life. But I now understood what had been brewing in the shadows, what Henry had planned in his envy-filled mind. In those days of recovery, I realized that the real threat is not in the obvious. It is not in the monsters or the ghosts that haunt us. The real threat is in those around us, in those who we believe to be our companions, but who within themselves harbor a darkness that even they do not understand. Life went on, but the relationship with Henry changed. He was no longer the partner with whom I shared the office, but a stranger, a distant being whose intentions became crystal clear. The promotion he wanted so badly did not come, at least not in the way he expected. The truth came out and my name was cleared. But through it all, what surprised me most was the coldness with which Henry acted in the end. He showed no regret, no remorse in his eyes, just the satisfaction of knowing that he had reached his goal somehow. But he did not realize what he had really lost. The poison he tried to use to destroy me was the same poison that destroyed him, because sometimes people get lost in their own desires, not realizing that the harm they are trying to inflict on others is consuming them from the inside. Poison is not always something you drink or eat. Sometimes the poison is the desire, the envy, the resentment that grows in the heart and destroys the one who carries it. Today, after all that has happened, I find myself here, reflecting on what happened. The coffee, the rain, the storm, Henry's life and death. Everything is a cycle that repeats itself in the history of people. There is no end to greed, but I realize too that not all poisons can be seen. Some are in gestures, in unspoken words, in the way someone looks at you with a mixture of admiration and desire. That's the real poison, the one that hides under the skin, in the darkest corners of the human mind. It's a reminder, perhaps, not to trust those around us completely, to be wary of intentions we believe to be pure, because often, the greatest danger is in places where we least expect it. The poison of hatred, like the one Henry harbored, is silent and effective. It does not spill over a visible surface or dissolve in a glass, but seeps slowly into actions, words, gestures. A poison that slowly consumes the one who carries it, until his desire to destroy the other leads to his own undoing. Throughout my life, I have learned that threats do not always come from what we can see or anticipate. Sometimes evil is camouflaged in the everyday, in what we think is harmless, like a simple coffee or a daily routine. We must not let blind trust lead us into the abyss. Life is a constant balance between security and distrust, between what we see and what we do not want to see. And in all this chaos, the lesson that resonates most with me is this: not all that glitters is gold, and not everything that seems harmless is safe. The real threats are the ones hidden behind smiles, compliments, and small attentions. Sometimes the worst poison is the one that comes to us from those we least expect it. Today, after everything that has happened, I have become more cautious, more observant. My vision of the world has changed. I have learned that the deepest scars are not always the physical ones. Some are inside, marked by betrayal, mistrust, and envy. But I have also learned something even more valuable, that in the midst of darkness, one can find light. True strength lies in how we respond to adversity. In my case, I survived, and with that, I understood that even if the storms are relentless, There is always a way to rebuild. When the rain began to fall that afternoon, I didn't know that it would be the beginning of something that would change my life forever. It wasn't the usual storm. It wasn't the calm rain that sometimes helped me think or even relax. It was a heavy downpour, almost furious, as if the sky was bursting at the seams and there was no way to stop it. What at first seemed like a passing storm quickly became an unsettling backdrop for what was to follow. I remember that day clearly. I was at home, doing nothing in particular as I usually do when work and life give me a break. The routine seemed normal to me, the daily chores, the quiet of home, the feeling of being accountable to no one. A couple of weeks ago, I had received a friend request on one of my social networks. I didn't think much about it. Often networks are full of strangers who for some reason decide to connect with you. Sometimes someone feels like sharing a bit of their life, commenting on your posts or sending you a casual message. But on this occasion, the name that popped up was unfamiliar to me. It was a simple name, with no profile picture or anything that would immediately tell me it was someone I was close to. I decided to accept it without giving it too much importance. The first few days passed without incident. A couple of trivial messages came in, some asking me for advice on banal things, others simply asking questions, as if they were trying to start a normal conversation. I would respond politely, as usual. At some point, however, something changed. Messages started coming in that became more and more disturbing. They weren't direct threats, or anything that would immediately put me on alert, but they were strange. As if the stranger was watching my every move, every step I took through the networks. He knew details about my life, about my work, even about my friends and the people I met regularly. I can't say that at first it really worried me. I thought that maybe someone was innocently investigating me. But what came next was anything but innocent. Suddenly, fake posts started appearing on my networks, something as absurd as edited images of me mixed with comments I had never made. It was clear that someone had been spending time constructing a narrative about me that didn't correspond to reality. Before long, my followers began to wonder, to send private messages asking if these posts were real. And it wasn't that I was worried about what people thought, but that more and more people were starting to send me those same questions, so much so that I could no longer ignore it. It was one rainy afternoon, like so many others, when it all started to escalate. It was no longer just the virtual threat. It was then that I found a note on the door of my house, a crumpled note, wet from the rain that fell incessantly. It was a handwritten message with an irregular handwriting, almost as if it was written by someone who could not control his nervousness or anxiety. There was no name, just an address and the words, "I know what you have done." The first thing I did was look around. There was no one there. The sound of the rain enveloped me completely. But something in the air, something in the silence that accompanied it made me feel that I was not alone, as if the whole world around me had vanished. It was minutes, maybe more, before I managed to muster enough courage to go back inside and lock the door. That was the first step, but not the last. The rain continued, and with it the warnings. The messages stopped being ambiguous, they became direct threats. In the hours that followed, I did nothing but stare at my phone screen, watching as new posts began to fill my profile, distorting my image in front of those who knew me. Each message I received increased my anxiety. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Something was happening, and I didn't know what to do. The following days were a nightmare. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but there was something in the air that I couldn't help but notice. Windows were closing, doors were locking, every noise out of place, every shadow that moved. It was as if that man was there, waiting. One night, when the rain had already begun to pound my window hard, as if the whole world was trying to press in on me, I heard something. A knock on the door, followed by the sound of footsteps I didn't recognize. My heart began to beat rapidly. For a moment I thought it was the rain, but when I heard the second knock, I knew it was not. I walked over to the window, gasping for breath. Outside, almost invisible in the darkness, was a figure, a man. He was there, standing in the storm, not moving, watching me. My mind began to race. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Fear paralyzed me, but I had no choice. With uncontrollable trembling, I picked up the phone and dialed the police number. I did it without thinking. I didn't know what else to do. When I managed to get through, the words were harder than I had imagined. There is someone outside watching my house and I have no idea what to do. This is absolutely frustrating. The wait was endless. The seconds became hours. Every time I looked outside the window, the figure was still there, motionless. The wind whipped, the rain fell relentlessly, but the man remained. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw the blue and red lights of police cars. The man disappeared into the darkness. There was no struggle, no shouting, no confrontation, just the sound of the wind and the rain. When the police arrived, they searched everything, but the man was gone. He had disappeared as if he had never been there. I never knew who he was or why he was doing it or what he wanted from me. The only certainty was that he had been there, and that I now felt more vulnerable than ever. Days passed, but I could never stop looking over my shoulder. Every time the rain hit the windows, I felt like I was being watched. That feeling never left me. Today, when I think about what happened, I am left with only one reflection. The greatest terror is not always in what we see or understand. Sometimes the worst is what we do not know, what we cannot control. Fear is not only the direct threat, but the constant uncertainty of knowing that someone may be watching you, waiting for the right moment to act. And though the storm of that night passed, the echo of its presence lingers. I don't know if I will ever really be safe. In a networked world, there is no total escape. No one is truly safe, and that's what haunts me even today. Who was he? What did he want? The rain keeps falling, and I keep waiting. We live in an era where interconnectedness is almost ubiquitous. Social media, smartphones, instant messaging apps, everything is designed to keep us connected. However, this connectedness has made us vulnerable in ways we had not anticipated. It is true that never before have we had access to so much information or so much instant interaction, but we have also exposed ourselves to situations beyond our ability to control. This incident, like so many others like it, that occur in the shadows of the web, highlights a disturbing truth. In this digital world, our lives can be invaded without us even noticing. Someone can be watching us, gathering information about us, constructing a narrative of who we are, and at some point, that narrative can become a real threat. What started as a simple message on a social network can end up being a spiral of harassment, manipulation, and even physical danger. Terror is not always visible. It is not always accompanied by shouting or violent confrontations. Sometimes the real fear is the fear of the unknown, the fear of what is beyond our reach, the fear of being watched without being able to do anything about it. It is a sense of constant vulnerability, a shadow that never quite goes away. We wonder perhaps if there is anything we can do to protect ourselves. Can we protect our privacy in a world that demands we share everything? Can we trust our networks not to become weapons against us? There are no easy answers. What is certain is that this episode left me with a profound lesson. In an increasingly interconnected world, what we sometimes lose is not only our privacy, but also our peace of mind. Fear is not always the storm that threatens us. Sometimes it is the storm that brewed on the horizon, unbeknownst to us, and that when it arrives has already reached us. Since that January 15th, 2022, my life is no longer the same. The storm began to fall with such force that morning that the sound of the drops hitting the glass of my office window became a kind of somber accompaniment. Through the window, one could only see a sea of rain falling mercilessly on the streets, while fog enveloped every corner of the city. However, what was most disturbing was not the weather, but the strange feeling that gripped me. There was something heavy in the atmosphere, something that made me feel that I was not alone, as if something or someone was lurking in the shadows of the daily routine. That morning, like all the others, I woke up early and dressed leisurely. I had spent weeks mired in a kind of routine lethargy. Work, coffee, emails, meetings. The days slipped by in a monotony that seemed unbreakable. I sat in front of my computer screen, hoping that the day would be as predictable as all the others. I went through the emails, answered some, discarded others, but when I opened a message, everything changed. "Francisco, I need your help. The person following you has valuable information. Find out what he knows. You have to do it before you find out." The message left me paralyzed. I didn't know what to think. First of all, I didn't know the person who had sent it to me, and secondly, the idea that someone was following me seemed so absurd that I didn't know whether to laugh or worry. However, there was something about that email that was not normal. It was not a joke, nor was it a meaningless message. The tone was serious, urgent, and worst of all, the message contained my first name, my last name, and a direct reference to someone who was apparently following me. As my mind began to formulate questions, the pressure in my chest became more palpable. What did it all mean? Who could be behind this warning? Despite the confusion, I decided to close the computer. I needed to get some fresh air, clear my mind, and think about something else. I got up, left the office, and lost myself in the streets, aimlessly, hoping that the storm would help me clear my thoughts. The rain was coming down hard, and the streets were beginning to flood. The city, usually so familiar, had become a strange place, covered by a thick fog that seemed to swallow the horizon. I walked for quite a while, but the feeling of being watched did not leave me alone for a moment. I looked around, but saw nothing unusual. Still, something told me that I was not alone. Suddenly, as I rounded a corner, I saw a shadow crossing the street quickly in the opposite direction. It was a fleeting flash, but enough to make my heart beat faster. Was it the man in the photo? Was it him, the stranger who had been mentioned in the mail? Or maybe just my paranoia had reached new levels. I decided enough was enough and returned home. When I arrived, I noticed something strange in my apartment mailbox. A letter with no sender, just a name. Francisco. I took it with trembling hands and went into my apartment. I closed the door behind me and upon opening the envelope, found a black and white photo of a man I didn't know. His back was turned, walking down a deserted street. The image was blurry, but something made me feel I recognized the street. However, it wasn't the man that puzzled me, but the feeling that the image had been taken recently. Who could be watching me in such detail? I sat at the table, unable to stop thinking about the message and the photo. The questions were multiplying, but the answers were not coming. The next few days were a mixture of anxiety, paranoia, and bewilderment. The clues piled up, but never seemed to make sense. A couple of days later, during a visit to a nearby cafe, I noticed a man watching me insistently. His eyes never stopped following me, and although I tried not to look directly at him, his presence was unmistakable. Every time I raised my head, the guy would simply smile and get up to leave as if nothing had happened. Although my instinct told me that I should follow him, prudence prevented me from acting impulsively. What would I gain by following him? What would I do if I ran into him? The wisest thing to do seemed to be to ignore him. That same night, the storm intensified. The streetlights began to flicker and a feeling of tension came over me. I went to sleep, but thoughts kept swirling around in my head. The emails, the photos, the man in the cafe, everything seemed to be connected, but how? I didn't know what was going on, but the danger seemed to be getting closer and closer. The next morning, the scenario changed. I finally got something more concrete, the private investigator who had been following me. I wasn't as surprised as I should have been because somehow I had already sensed it. However, what left me cold was the information contained in the folder handed to me by a contact in the underworld. Inside it were meticulous details about my daily life, my schedules, my work and leisure places, my habits, even the routes I took to get home. And worst of all, a recent photograph of the man who had watched me in the cafe. This time he was not blurry. He was looking directly at me, and his face showed a cold indifference that chilled me to the bone. When I returned home that night, the storm was raging with such intensity that the city seemed to have been plunged into complete darkness. Arriving at my apartment, I noticed something strange. The kitchen light was on. I knew for sure that I had not left it on. With my heart racing, I entered cautiously, trying not to make a sound. The sound of water falling from the ceiling made everything seem even more unsettling. The feeling that something or someone had been there came over me immediately. In the dining room, a chair was in disarray, as if someone had been sitting there. And on the table, the man's picture, with a handwritten note underneath. "Do you look safe to me?" The feeling of being trapped intensified at that moment. It wasn't paranoia. Someone was playing a game on me, and I had no idea what the rules were. I didn't understand what this person wanted from me. But something told me the answer was closer than I thought. One night, as I was walking down a lonely passage to avoid the crowd, I stopped when I saw a figure at the end of the alley. It was him, the man in the photo. His presence was so palpable that I didn't need him to say a single word. His cold, calculating stare said it all. I could not escape. I knew that my movements had been predetermined, calculated from the beginning. At that moment, the truth became clear. My life was no longer mine as soon as someone decided to follow me. The game had begun and I was the piece. It no longer mattered what I had done in the past, what I had planned for the future. The web of intrigue in which I was trapped was so deep that I could see no way out. I didn't know who had hired me or what they wanted from me. I only knew that my destiny no longer belonged to me. Throughout the days and nights, the shadows seemed to spread to every corner of my life. And it was then that I understood that life is not always a game in which we are the players. Sometimes we are simply the pieces, and worst of all, we don't know who is pulling the strings. Reflecting on all that happened, I realized that the real fear is not of being watched, but of losing control of our own existence. We spend our lives believing that we are the protagonists of our own history, that we have the power to decide our own destiny. But in the end, who really knows if everything we do is the result of our own choices? Or if perhaps we are simply part of a bigger game, one in which we are not even aware of being players. My name is Braulio. I'm not someone from whom you would expect a horror story. I have no extraordinary life, no dark events or sinister secrets. My existence was simple, normal. My routine was that of any average person. Work, the solitude of my apartment, the small visits to the supermarket. Perhaps for that reason, what I am about to tell you is even more disturbing. Because what started as an accident, a simple coincidence, has ended up becoming an endless nightmare. It all started one rainy night, one of those when the storm is not just a meteorological phenomenon, but a palpable presence, hovering over everything, drowning out sounds and plunging everything into deep darkness. The rain pounded on my window panes like a chaotic symphony, while the light from the street barely made it through the haze. It was the kind of night when one takes refuge in the stillness, in the silence of one's own home. I was no different. I was alone, as always. I found the rain comforting. In its rumbling, I found peace. But that night, something changed. I had gone out to the corner store to buy a few groceries. It was nothing important. Just a short walk to stock up. As I returned to my apartment, I realized something strange was happening. Near the doorway, there was a figure. I didn't stop to look at it closely, but there was something about it that made me uncomfortable. The person was completely drenched, covering herself with a dark trench coat, as if she didn't care about the storm. Her posture was stiff, as if she was waiting for something. I didn't dare look at her again. I quickened my pace, and as I reached the door, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something told me I should go in quickly and not look back. And that's what I did. I closed the door with more force than usual and walked away towards the inside of the apartment, not wanting to give the matter any more importance. I thought that, as always, my life would go on as usual. That this figure would be just a coincidence, one of the many chance encounters one has when living in a city full of strangers. But it was not so. That night, after closing the windows and turning off the lights, something strange happened. I began to hear soft knocking on the door. At first I ignored them, convinced that the wind or the storm was causing the sound. However, the knocking was repeated, this time with more force. Intrigued and somewhat nervous, I got up and approached the door viewer. I peered cautiously. From there, I could make out shadows moving in the hallway, but there was no one in front of my door. I felt a strange pressure in the air, as if the whole environment had become dense and heavy. Fear began to grip me, but I didn't know what to do. Something was happening, but I couldn't explain it. I felt my mind cloud over, as if I could no longer trust my own senses. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a faint whisper, as if someone was talking through the lock on my door. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone of the voice was haunting, as if it had known me all my life. I could not move. Paralysis came over me. All I could do was stand there, staring into the darkness, while the feeling of being watched grew more intense. The visits continued, always during the storm, always at the same time, always without a trace. The presence of that figure, of those murmurs and whispers, haunted me day after day. Anguish was building up in my chest, but the worst of it all was not the feeling of being watched. Worst of all was the feeling that something was waiting for me, as if I had an appointment with destiny, an appointment I could not evade. I no longer felt safe in my own home, a place I had always considered my refuge. There was something in the air, something dark, creeping along the walls in the corners, something that was inside me. One night, as the storm was reaching its peak intensity, The phone rang. I didn't answer it, but a strange urge urged me to listen to the voicemail, and when I did, I heard something that chilled my blood. The same voice I had heard whispering at my door now spoke clearly, as if it had known me forever. The voice mentioned to me a gift I possessed, something I didn't understand, something that attracted a dark force, a cult that had begun to notice my presence. At first, I didn't quite understand what they were talking about, but as the words progressed, I began to feel it. I was being marked. There was something about me that called to them, something that made them seek me out. That gift, they mentioned, seemed to me a curse rather than a blessing. The days that followed became a constant struggle. I couldn't go to the police, I couldn't talk to anyone. The fear consumed me, but at the same time there was a part of me that felt I couldn't ignore it. The rain, which had once brought me comfort, had become a constant reminder that something was lurking. The visits intensified. I felt their eyes on every corner of the city as if they were watching me from everywhere, as if an invisible net was surrounding me. There was no escape. The psychological torment began to devour me. The voices in my head became louder, more urgent. They spoke to me constantly, repeating to me that I should join them, that I should accept what had been given to me. But I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand what was happening, and every time I tried to rationalize it, I found myself more lost, more trapped. One day, consumed by despair, I decided to escape. I grabbed the bare essentials, my documents, my phone, and went out into the storm aimlessly without a plan. I ran, not knowing where. The rain was soaking me, but it didn't matter. My mind was in a frenzy, but the pounding in my mind wouldn't stop. The shadows wouldn't leave me, and the storm seemed to have no end. I took refuge in an alley, seeking to hide, looking for something to give me relief. But then I felt that presence, the same one that had stalked me from the beginning, closer than ever. And when I looked back, there they were. A group of people dressed in dark clothes, walking towards me with a terrifying calmness. They did not attack me. They didn't touch me. But their gazes pierced me. It was as if they could read every thought, every fear I harbored. And at that moment I understood the worst. I couldn't escape. I couldn't hide. I was trapped, and no matter how much I ran, I could never escape. Something inside me understood that I had never been. From that moment on, escape was no longer an option. Escape was an illusion. I never left my home again. The storms continued, and the voices continued. Every corner of my apartment was riddled with whispers, as if the walls themselves were talking to me. I never felt loneliness again, but neither did I feel comfort. Anguish devoured me little by little as I became more and more immersed in the darkness that surrounded me. I no longer knew if the cults existed or if the real nightmare was my mind. But the worst thing was neither the storm nor the shadows. The worst was the realization that the real danger was not outside, but inside me. That everything I feared, everything that terrified me, was the result of my own decisions, of my fears. That ultimately the web that surrounded me was the web that my own thinking had woven. Today, in the quiet of my home, I realized something important. Fear is only the beginning. And when fear feeds on our doubts, on our wrong decisions, it traps us, it consumes us. The storm doesn't let up, and I don't know if I want it to anymore, because in the end, one realizes that there is no escape. The real enemy is inside, and as long as we keep running away from him, we will always be trapped. The rain was hitting the glass with a fury that seemed to want to shatter it. The sound of the drops was constant, a dull and heavy symphony that accompanied my every thought. Since I arrived here, nothing seemed normal. The place, that laboratory in the middle of nowhere, seemed to be designed to hide from any curious gaze. It was isolated, with no phone signal or internet access, as if the outside world did not exist. Just me, them, and the rain. My name was Angel, and it was an offer I couldn't refuse. They had come to me through an email that looked like something out of a spy movie. Everything was too perfect. A unique opportunity to earn money. But what they didn't tell me was that I was being selected for something much darker. At first, everything seemed normal. Some medical tests, psychological interviews. I was told it was a study to develop advanced mental health treatments. It wasn't what I was most interested in, but the pay was so high that I didn't even hesitate. On the first day, everything went smoothly. I was placed in a room that, although austere, had the necessities: a bed, a desk, a small bathroom. The staff was efficient but distant. No one explained anything about what was going to happen. They just told me to follow the directions. It was a mechanical routine. I was woken up, given pills, and then subjected to a series of tests. Sometimes I felt watched, but it was just a feeling. I thought it was part of the process. However, on the third day, I began to notice something strange. Every time I passed through the corridors, the scientists looked at me with an intensity that made me uneasy. It was not the kind of professional look I expected from a team of experts. They were furtive glances, as if they were watching something more than just a test subject. Something inside me began to alert me. There was something that didn't fit. Something in the air, in the atmosphere, that told me I should leave, but I still didn't know why. The rain, which at first seemed like just a constant noise, began to become a metaphor for my growing paranoia. Torrential water pounded against the windows, and as the storm raged outside, I felt something worse was raging inside that place. There were days when I didn't see any of the other subjects. The doors to the rooms remained closed, the hallways empty. When I met any of the scientists, their answers were vague, evasive. They avoided looking directly at me, as if it were a secret routine that I was not supposed to understand. Time dragged on in that place. The days seemed to have no beginning and no end. Every night when I went to bed, I listened to the sound of the storm, louder and louder, as if the world was about to collapse. But what really terrified me was not the wind or the water. It was the growing sense of being trapped in something much bigger and more dangerous than I had been told. I felt that there was something constantly watching me, as if the scientists were waiting for a reaction, a change that I could not yet understand. It was on the fourth night that I began to realize that something was not only strange, but downright dangerous. I was in the testing room, where I had been placed for some sort of continuous observation, and as I tried to remain calm, I saw something I will never forget. One of the doors that was normally closed opened for an instant, a quick glance, but just enough for my eyes to catch something terrifying. One of the people who had come with me, a man in his 30s, was being dragged in by two of the scientists. He didn't seem to have the strength to resist. He was being led into the darkness of a corridor I had never seen before. The terror on his face, the desperation in his eyes was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I couldn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there, staring at the closed door, knowing something horrible had happened. A few minutes later, the door slammed shut. I stood there, silent, wondering if everything I had witnessed was real. I couldn't tell anyone. I didn't know if it had been a dream or a vision. My head was about to explode. The feeling of helplessness was unbearable. I couldn't escape. I couldn't even ask for help. The laboratory, which had seemed so professional at first, was now showing me its darkest face. I was trapped, and the storm outside seemed to be the only comfort I had left. A rain that covered the noises of the fear that gripped me. Later that day, one of the scientists asked me to accompany him to another room. I walked after him without saying a word. When we arrived, he stood silently in front of a screen, watching some kind of information. There was no emotion on his face, just an impassive expression. Suddenly, I realized that something was changing in my body, something strange. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the same storm from outside had seeped into me. My legs were trembling and my whole body tensed with the fear that was beginning to invade me. I was trapped and had no way to escape. In the distance, I heard something that made me shudder. The sound of keys being turned in a door that was at the back of the hallway. The man who had been dragged in had not returned. He had seen no one else since that night. The doctor's words, though simple, took on a much more sinister meaning as time passed. This is a controlled experiment, he had told me, as if it were a justification for what was happening. But no, it wasn't just an experiment. It was something much darker, something that transcended any ethics or morals. The lives of the subjects didn't matter. They were pieces of an experiment whose magnitude I could not even comprehend. That night, when everything had fallen silent, I decided I could go no further. I didn't know how many of us were left, but I could no longer wait to be next. The rain continued to fall, hitting the windows with the same fury. I felt the weight of each drop, as if they were the last drops of time I had left. I was no longer just an experiment. I had fallen into a black hole where humanity vanished and only the void of science without morals remained. That night, As the storm raged with greater force, I decided to act. I would escape from that place before it was too late. As I wandered into the dark corridors, searching for a way out, my heart pounded like never before. Each step was heavier than the last, and the sound of the storm drowned out everything, even my thoughts. The darkness of the corridors seemed to swallow the light of the small flashing bulbs. At times, I thought I saw shadows slipping by, but I didn't stop. I knew I had to keep going. I couldn't trust anyone here. I couldn't even trust my mind, which was starting to spin out of control. The scientists knew something was going on, but it was too late. I had discovered too much. Finally, when I reached an exit, what I saw outside paralyzed me. The storm was so violent that the lights in the lab were flickering, but I managed to realize that something was wrong. I was not alone. I felt the stares on my back, those cold, soulless stares. They knew I was running away. They knew there was no turning back. I ran into the darkness of the rain, and even though my legs couldn't take it anymore, I didn't stop. The rain soaked me completely. It didn't matter. At least I was free. But freedom was just an empty concept. What would happen next? Where would I go? Could I trust what I had experienced? Was I really free, or had I just been part of a bigger plan? Every drop of rain seemed a reminder that freedom, as I had known it, no longer existed. As I ran, one question lingered in my mind. How many like me would be trapped in places like that? How many human beings would have been sacrificed in the name of a supposed scientific breakthrough? The answer I didn't know, and I feared I never would. I escaped from the lab, but I know there are things that cannot be forgotten. There are secrets too dark to ignore, and even though I managed to escape, my soul will never be the same. The impact of what happened there remains imbued in my thoughts, a shadow that never fades even if I try to forget it. What happened in that place was no accident. It was not just a failed experiment. It was a meticulous practice, a power play where human lives were worth nothing. And perhaps the most terrifying thing is not what they did, but that it happened behind our backs, unbeknownst to the world. Today, when I hear the sound of rain hitting the windows, I can't help but think that something darker lurks in the hidden corners of our society. What are we capable of allowing when we are not looking? And worst of all, how many more will fall into the same deceptions without knowing it? For years, I have not been able to forget that May 29th, the day my life changed forever. The rain that night fell with such unusual fury that it seemed as if the sky itself was crumbling to the ground. The rumbling of the thunder, which never ceased, vibrated in every corner of my body. The darkness seemed to be an oppressive blanket that enveloped me, and not for the first time. I wondered if somehow all that was nothing more than a reflection of what was going on inside me. My mind has never been the same since. My name is Antonio, and I am responsible for that man's downfall. I knew him as a former employee, although in reality I always knew that his face in the office was just a mask. An ordinary, harmless-looking man, trapped in a life that, like many, he hated. His name was Javier, and he was just another cog in the machinery of the dairy corporation where we worked. Nothing extraordinary, or so I thought. For months, Javier had proven to be an efficient worker, although somewhat peculiar. A solitary man, one of those who kept everything to himself. His eyes seemed empty, and the smile on his face never reached his eyes. I was not surprised when, after a series of layoffs, his name appeared on the list. It had been a decision I had made without much thought, as part of an adjustment the company needed. But little did I know that I had made a decision that would drive me to the brink of insanity. May 29th was the first day I felt something was wrong. The rain was pouring down mercilessly, and I was rushing to get to an important meeting with company executives. That day, the stress was consuming me, and the feeling that everything was falling apart was imminent. What I didn't know was that on that day, my life was in much more real danger than I had imagined. As I walked back to my car after the meeting, the air was saturated with the strong smell of wet earth. The streets were deserted, and the storm was relentless. I got into the car, quickly closing the door. I drove without thinking, as I always did, lost in my thoughts. Visibility was minimal. The windshield wipers could not cope with the amount of water falling, and the wind was violently shaking the branches of the trees on both sides of the road. The tension in the air was palpable, but that was the least of it. What happened next is what I will never be able to erase from my mind. As I stepped on the accelerator to get out of town and take the back road to my house, the direction of the car abruptly changed. I had no time to react. A violent turn threw me against the edge of the road and the car began to skid, out of control. I felt the wheels slip on the accumulated water, and my heart raced in rhythm with my frantic breathing. The rain and wind were nothing compared to the feeling of knowing something wasn't right. I knew right away. The brakes were not responding. My mind raced for an explanation, but there was no time for it. I could see the retaining wall approaching, the car was still skidding, and my attempts to brake only made the situation worse. That dreadful sound, the crunching of the tires as they slid over the water, stuck in my memory, like a deafening echo still ringing in my ears. The car finally stopped upon hitting the wall, miraculously without overturning. My nerves were on edge, my breathing was irregular, and my head was pounding. I didn't understand what had happened. At that moment, I just wanted to breathe. But what terrified me most was that there had been no apparent reason for the car to lose control like that. The brakes were completely locked. At first, I thought it had just been a mechanical failure, but the first thought that crossed my mind was darker, more pervasive. What if someone did it on purpose? Arriving home that night, my mind in shock, the image of Javier began to loom in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about him, his vacant stare, his increasingly distant presence in the office. Something in his demeanor had changed after his dismissal. In fact, I hadn't seen him since the day he left the company. And that same night, my heart was filled with an uncomfortable feeling. Something was haunting me, something that came from a mind that fed on resentment. I didn't understand what had happened until much later, but after that day, I began to feel the constant presence of something, or someone, watching me. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't help but notice small anomalies in my daily life. At first, they were irrelevant details. A missed message on my phone, a door I always found ajar, the sound of my doorbell ringing when no one was there. But soon, the details began to accumulate and become more disturbing. I couldn't sleep without feeling watched. In my most fragile moments, I felt like someone was always nearby, lurking in the shadows. Every time I took the car, I would check it thoroughly, but the feeling of insecurity never went away. The fear had penetrated deep into my being. I knew at that moment that someone was behind it all, that someone had played with my life in the same way one plays with a simple pawn on a chessboard. And that someone, finally, was none other than Javier. I knew it without a doubt when I discovered the little letter he left me in the glove compartment of the car one night, after a trip in which I felt again the threat of losing control. There were no words on it, just a symbol, a drawing, a broken chess piece, a cryptic message, but it made clear what had been happening. Javier had cut the brakes on my car that night, and now, with every move he made, I felt like just another pawn in his macabre game. My life was no longer the same after that. I dared not trust anyone, not on the streets, not in my home, not even in my own mind. Constant fear made me paranoid. Every shadow seemed to hide a danger. Every noise at night was the harbinger of something fatal. Every dawn was marked by the uncertainty of knowing if that would be the last time I would see sunlight. The scariest thing of all, what I never fully understood, is how someone who was once so insignificant to me could transform into the shadow that stalked me at every turn. Javier was not a ghost. He was not a supernatural being. He was a man, a human being who had been pushed to the limit by rancor and pain. Someone who had found a way to destroy my life without needing to raise a hand. As the months passed, I began to analyze everything that had happened, trying to find some pattern, some logical explanation that would alleviate my growing anxiety. But what surprised me the most, what terrified me the most, was how a man so insignificant to me, a simple employee whom I had dismissed like someone who changes a broken piece of a gear, could have so much influence over my destiny. It seemed absurd, and yet the evidence left no room for doubt. I remember how one morning, as I watched the rain pattering on the window pane, something changed in me. For so long I had lived in constant fear with the feeling of being pursued by Javier. But as I watched the storm, I understood something I had been avoiding. The rain, that rain that seemed to mimic the darkness in my soul, was no longer the cause of my fear. I no longer feared Javier nor his vengeance. What had really changed me was the way our actions can trigger an unstoppable cycle, a game where we are all chess pieces. The lesson I learned, albeit belatedly, is that the decisions we make not only affect our lives but also the lives of those around us. A single act of cruelty, a single decision made without empathy, can unleash a chain of events that change the course of our existence. We are all vulnerable. even when we think we are safe, and another human being's grudge can become a destructive force. In the end, revenge is not only an act of justice for the one who seeks it, but a condemnation for both. And in the end, nothing is left but the echo of an endless storm, which sweeps everything in its path, leaving in its wake the memory of what could have been avoided. I no longer seek answers. I only know that the rains will never cease, and that somehow we are all trapped in this storm, together even if only some perceive it. My name is Fernando. 4 years ago, my life took a turn I never imagined, a free fall into an abyss of despair and regret. I was caught in a gambling game so unsustainable that it not only destroyed my economic well-being, but also threatened to take away the most important thing I had, my own life. A game where the danger came not from the paranormal or from invisible monsters, but from the people themselves, from their greed, their insatiable desire for power and control. A game so dangerous that in the end, the lines between reality and death blur, and fear is not something you can avoid. That night began like any other, with no foreshadowing or sign of what was to come. The rain was falling furiously from the dark sky, as if the world itself was crying for what was coming. I was driving down a lonely road, my car struggling against the wind pushing the storm. My thoughts were caught in a whirlwind of debt, wrong decisions, and endless regrets. I barely noticed the sound of the rain hitting the windows, so absorbed was I in my own thoughts. I reflected on how I had come to this situation, how my once promising life had crumbled before my very eyes. How was it possible that a successful man with a stable marriage and a career on the rise had ended up on this path of despair? A year ago, my life seemed to have everything one could wish for. A thriving business, a loving wife who supported me every step of the way, and a family who believed in my future. But a simple gambling game was enough to set off a chain of events that changed everything. At first, it was just a distraction, a way to ease the burden of the daily grind. I started with simple bets, in a clandestine environment, without thinking that something so insignificant could end up devouring my entire life. What seemed like an innocent form of entertainment quickly turned into an obsession. Every time I won, the desire for more consumed me. Every time I lost, the urge to win back what I lost dragged me back. I lost control not just of the money but of myself. That's when someone offered me the opportunity to participate in a bigger game, a game where the stakes were much higher, where the risks were unattainable. But desperation, the pressure of my debts, and the promise of a quick win were enough to convince me. I accepted the deal without fully understanding what awaited me, a sealed deal, but with rules that no one had explained to me. I didn't know what being on the inside really meant, what playing this deadly game entailed. What I belatedly discovered was that the real danger was not just in the financial stakes, but in the unwritten rules that governed this game. No one told you what would happen if you lost, nor how you were pushed to keep betting once you were in. What I realized is that the game itself was not just about money. The psychological manipulation, the implied threats, and the constant pressure from the people who organized the game sent me into a spiral of despair. These men were no ordinary gamblers. What they were after was not just money, but something far more dangerous: control. They needed power over me, over my life. As my car sped down the deserted road, the rain kept pounding on the windshield, almost like a constant reminder of what I had lost. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw for the first time the reflection of a man I no longer recognized. The traces of my past decisions haunted me, and my life had become a race against the clock. Suddenly, everything I had known, everything I had believed about myself seemed irrelevant. Gambling, which at the time seemed like an easy way out, had become a nightmare from which I could not escape. It had ceased to be a matter of money. It was now a matter of survival. I remember that last night with eerie clarity. I had lost everything I could lose, but the worst thing was not the money, nor the position I had lost in the world, nor the destruction of my career. The worst thing was that my very life was at stake. I couldn't get out, I couldn't run away. The stakes were no longer tangible. Everything was rigged. The people I had known, those who still held some humanity, no longer existed. They were disguised in cold masks of calculation and ambition. The rain lashed hard as if it wanted to destroy me once and for all, and I, trapped in my own despair, thought only of how I had come to this point. How, out of a desire to win, To regain what I had lost, I had ruined everything I had built. But at that moment, there was no turning back. There was no way to reverse the damage. I had crossed an invisible line, and I knew it. I no longer owned my life. The feeling of being just another piece in a much bigger game took hold of me. My name is Fernando. 4 years ago, my life took a turn I never imagined. A free fall into an abyss of despair and regret. I was caught in a gambling game so unsustainable that it not only destroyed my economic well-being, but also threatened to take away the most important thing I had, my own life. A game where the danger came not from the paranormal or from invisible monsters, but from the people themselves, from their greed, their insatiable desire for power and control. A game so dangerous that in the end, the lines between reality and death blur, and fear is not something you can avoid. That night began like any other, with no foreshadowing or sign of what was to come. The rain was falling furiously from the dark sky, as if the world itself was crying for what was coming. I was driving down a lonely road, my car struggling against the wind pushing the storm. My thoughts were caught in a whirlwind of debt, wrong decisions, and endless regrets. I barely noticed the sound of the rain hitting the windows, so absorbed was I in my own thoughts. I reflected on how I had come to this situation, how my once promising life had crumbled before my very eyes. How was it possible that a successful man with a stable marriage and a career on the rise had ended up on this path of despair? A year ago, my life seemed to have everything one could wish for. A thriving business, a loving wife who supported me every step of the way, and a family who believed in my future. But a simple gambling game was enough to set off a chain of events that changed everything. At first, it was just a distraction, a way to ease the burden of the daily grind. I started with simple bets, in a clandestine environment, without thinking that something so insignificant could end up devouring my entire life. What seemed like an innocent form of entertainment quickly turned into an obsession. Every time I won, the desire for more consumed me. Every time I lost, the urge to win back what I lost dragged me back. I lost control not just of the money but of myself. That's when someone offered me the opportunity to participate in a bigger game, a game where the stakes were much higher, where the risks were unattainable. But desperation, the pressure of my debts, and the promise of a quick win were enough to convince me. I accepted the deal without fully understanding what awaited me, a sealed deal, but with rules that no one had explained to me. I didn't know what being on the inside really meant, what playing this deadly game entailed. What I belatedly discovered was that the real danger was not just in the financial stakes, but in the unwritten rules that governed this game. No one told you what would happen if you lost, nor how you were pushed to keep betting once you were in. What I realized is that the game itself was not just about money. The psychological manipulation, the implied threats, and the constant pressure from the people who organized the game sent me into a spiral of despair. These men were no ordinary gamblers. What they were after was not just money, but something far more dangerous: control. They needed power over me, over my life. As my car sped down the deserted road, the rain kept pounding on the windshield, almost like a constant reminder of what I had lost. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw for the first time the reflection of a man I no longer recognized. The traces of my past decisions haunted me, and my life had become a race against the clock. Suddenly, everything I had known, everything I had believed about myself seemed irrelevant. Gambling, which at the time seemed like an easy way out, had become a nightmare from which I could not escape. It had ceased to be a matter of money. It was now a matter of survival. I remember that last night with eerie clarity. I had lost everything I could lose, but the worst thing was not the money, nor the position I had lost in the world, nor the destruction of my career. The worst thing was that my very life was at stake. I couldn't get out, I couldn't run away. The stakes were no longer tangible. Everything was rigged. The people I had known, those who still held some humanity, no longer existed. They were disguised in cold masks of calculation and ambition. The rain lashed hard as if it wanted to destroy me once and for all, and I, trapped in my own despair, thought only of how I had come to this point. How, out of a desire to win, to regain what I had lost, I had ruined everything I had built. But at that moment there was no turning back. There was no way to reverse the damage. I had crossed an invisible line, and I knew it. I no longer owned my life. The feeling of being just another piece in a much bigger game took hold of me. That night, I not only lost my last penny, but I also lost the most valuable thing I had, my identity. The gambling, the greed, the insatiable desire for control all had taken away what I loved most. My marriage completely fell apart. I couldn't even blame her for leaving. After all, how could I bear to live with someone who had destroyed so much of who we once were? Not only had I lied to myself, but I had also lied to the person who loved me the most. The guilt choked me, and I was tormented by the thought that all of this had been caused by my own selfishness, by my desire to win at all costs. The worst came later, when paranoia began to devour me. For a whole year, I could not leave my house. I felt watched, constantly haunted by the feeling that if I didn't pay what I owed, the consequences would be fatal. I knew they couldn't let me escape, but I also knew I wasn't the only one. There were others like me, trapped in a game with no way out. We were kept in an endless cycle of fear, despair, and debt, manipulated at their whim. The rain continued its relentless fall, and my car moved slowly forward, as if the road itself was punishing me for my own clumsiness. I looked through the soaked glass and saw a distant figure, far away, on the side of the road. My heart skipped a beat. The feeling that something even greater awaited me intensified. My mind, now clearer than ever, understood that there was nowhere to run. I could no longer escape this game. I could no longer escape what I had done. The only way out was to risk everything. But in doing so, he knew he would never be the same. The storm was still raging, and with it, the certainty that the real monster was not outside but inside. The worst thing was not the men who organized the game. It was not the rain that lashed the road. It was not the shadows that stalked me. The worst thing was that I myself had become part of the system that had brought me to ruin, part of the greed and insatiable desire for control that had ruined everything I once loved. The game ended that day, but the lesson endures. It's not just about the gambling or the material losses. The real lesson is that sometimes the worst monsters are not the ones lurking in the shadows, but the ones that live in the heart of every human being. The game of life is not just a game of money. It is a game of decisions, of values, and of what we are willing to sacrifice to get what we think we want. In my case, I lost everything, but sometimes losing everything is the only thing that allows us to see the truth. And although the storm finally calmed down, the scar on my soul remained forever. My name is Juan Manuel. I have always believed in the weight of our actions and how ideals can shape reality. But my thoughts, as firm as rock, did not save me from the fragility of my humanity. The rain beats furiously against the windshield as I drive down a deserted road. The windshield wipers struggle uselessly against the liquid curtain that seems to want to bury the whole world. I've been on the run for a year, and today, for the first time, I feel like this trip could be my last. The air inside the car is thick with memories and the sound of my own breathing. That day, a year ago, it was also raining. It was then that I first saw the wrong thing. It all started with my obsession for truth, an ideal that had led me to work on an innovative technology project. In such an interconnected world, I dreamed of building systems that protect, not destroy. But my naivete blinded me to the true intentions of the men around me. Those powerful men, with expensive suits and sharp smiles, were not interested in protecting anyone. Behind the routine meetings and neat presentations, there was a much darker design, a system capable of manipulating and controlling entire masses, all under the facade of a charitable innovation. A network that not only collected data but could mold minds, destroy reputations, and erase lives with the click of a button. I had unwittingly helped build it. I discovered the truth by accident. A poorly stored file, a few lines of code that didn't fit. I was too curious to look away. At first, I tried to confront my superior, a man I had considered a mentor. He responded not with words, but with a warning look. At that moment, I understood that I was alone. I tried to justify what I had found. Perhaps, I thought, it was not as terrible as it seemed. Maybe there was something I didn't fully understand, but the pieces kept falling into place, and the final picture was darker than I could have imagined. I understood that the system we had designed was not just collecting data for commercial purposes, but was being used to build accurate psychological profiles of millions of people, and it wasn't helping them. I decided to act. If my work had contributed to the birth of this aberration, then I had to be the one to destroy it. It was a rash decision, I know, but what choice did I have? I made the mistake of underestimating what I faced. Someone as small as me could not bring down a structure built on a foundation of power and corruption. The night I decided to leak the information was the same night everything changed. I'm not stupid. I took precautions, used secure networks, aliases, and methods I thought impossible to trace. But they were always one step ahead. The rain was torrential when I left my apartment, carrying a hard drive with enough evidence to convict them all. I didn't get very far. A car with no lights followed me to a desolate intersection. The impact was brutal, and although my car was totaled, I survived. Maybe I shouldn't have. I remember the blood dripping from my forehead mixing with the rain and the silhouette of a man approaching steadily. They didn't kill me that night. They wanted worse. They wanted me to live with the weight of constant fear, knowing that my life, my freedom, no longer belonged to me. Since then, I have been on the run. I changed my name, my appearance, my country. But I always find their traces. A gaze too fixed in the crowd, a message without sender, a shadow that shouldn't be there. They seek me not just for revenge, but for control. I'm a loose end they can't afford to let loose. I have learned to anticipate them, or at least I think I have. But the price has been my peace, my nights, my mind. Paranoia has become my only companion. Faces that once meant refuge and love are now potential threats. The road becomes more winding, and the taillights of a truck are drawn like blurry red spots in front of me. I think about stopping, about finally giving in to exhaustion. But then, something in the rearview mirror catches my attention. Headlights approaching at full speed. My body tenses and fear wraps me like a shroud. It's not paranoia. I know it's them. I press on the accelerator, even though the slippery terrain makes the wheels skid. My heart is pounding, not so much from the impending danger, but from the certainty that the end is near. No matter how hard I run, they will always be there. They are bigger than me, stronger, more ruthless. The chase lasts just a few minutes, but it feels like hours. I try to stay in control, but the rain and the speed are a deadly combination. The car skids, spins, and everything stops in a crunch of metal and glass. The impact leaves me dazed, but I'm not unconscious. I can hear the sound of footsteps approaching, the doors of the other vehicle closing with a cold, final click. I don't have the strength to run away. I'm trapped in this seat, blood running down my face once again. The door opens and the last thing I see are those unperturbed faces, those I once considered allies. There is no need for words. Everything has already been said amidst the silence and the rain. When I wake up, I am not in the car. I'm in a dark, windowless room with a dull ache in my head and my wrists bound. I don't know how long it's been, but I know this is the culmination of my story. If anyone ever finds this, I want them to understand something. It is not power that destroys the world, but the indifference of those around you. I tried to fight, but I failed because I was not strong enough. Perhaps if more people had watched, if more had acted, things would have been different. Now, I am a man who has lost everything. Except one lesson. The real danger is not in the machines we create, but in the men who control them. The rain lashed the roof of the small cottage, echoing off the wooden walls, rumbling like a frenzied crowd wanting to get inside. It could not be an ordinary storm. The wind, that wind that came from the north, seemed to scream, as did my thoughts. It had been 2 months since my life had changed forever, and over the course of those days, this storm had become a reflection of my own mind, an uncontrollable, dark fury that stalked me relentlessly. I am Pedro Jimenez, and if there is one thing I can say with certainty, it is that my name is no longer the same. For 2 months, I have lived under an alien identity, that of Aureliano Gonzalez, a man whose existence was marked by a terrible crime. The weight of that borrowed life, of that person I am not, has been heavier than any storm I have ever known. The first day I assumed Aureliano's identity, my mind could not process it all. Memories of his life, of his family, of his friends, mingled with mine in a chaotic way. But at some point, I understood that there was no turning back. I could no longer go back to what I was before, because even if I tried, what I had left behind no longer belonged to me. The imprint I had left on Aureliano's life was much deeper than any trait of my being. I had made a grave mistake by getting involved in something much bigger than myself, something I never knew enough about. But what was worse was that, as I took his place, I was caught in a web of lies and secrets that I could not fully comprehend. The people around me didn't know I was no longer him, but they felt it. Somehow the looks in their eyes told me what I no longer wanted to hear. Something had changed. Something had broken. My refuge, that little house, became the prison where my mind struggled between what had been and what was now meant to be. Every night when the storm raged furiously, I felt the pressure of reality on me, the pressure of the men who were looking for Aureliano. They didn't know I wasn't him, but they knew I had to pay. And the storm was not the only one growing in that house. So was my fear, my desperation. The phone rang in the house intermittently. At first I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone wanted to talk to Aureliano, or thought he was still there. But every time it rang, my heart stopped for a moment. I knew the calls were not harmless. How could someone so close to Aureliano's crime seek him out and yet not notice me? What had Aureliano really done? I couldn't stop wondering, and the more I did, the more I was plunged into anguish. A serious crime, they said. Serious for whom? For him, or for those who were chasing him? The rain, that constant, monotonous sound, did nothing but drown my thoughts. It was as if the whole world was under the control of something I could not comprehend. In those moments, the feeling of being trapped in an invisible net hit me with the same force as the wind hitting the windows. As the days went by, I realized that Aureliano's traces would not be erased. The people who knew him, those who were part of his life, began to act differently. Their distrust hit me harder than any storm. Memories of Aureliano came and went in bursts. Sometimes I would find myself standing in front of the mirror staring at the face of a man who was not mine. I wondered, who was I really? What part of me still existed? And what part of me had vanished into the darkness of this deadly game? The answers, of course, were not coming. There was only silence, that dense, suffocating silence that gripped the house, my soul. Every day, Aureliano's footprints became more intense, more difficult to ignore. People began to ask about him, but who was he really? I only knew that he had done something irreparable, something that had put him in a spiral of despair and blood. And now that weight was on my shoulders, as if the rain itself was washing away the trace of what had happened. The storm, however, was not the only one that grew in those days. The days grew longer, and with them the tension increased. I began to notice that someone was watching me, but I could never see it. A shadow, something moving in the corners of my vision, as if everything I had done during that time was attracting attention I didn't want. The calls continued, always unanswered. And as I went on, the sense that I was not alone grew. One night, the rain poured down like never before. The house was shaking under the weight of the wind and the water pounding the walls. I got up from the chair where I had been sitting for hours, watching the storm outside the window. I don't know how long it had been since I had last gone for a walk in the garden. Maybe a month, or 2, or 3. Time had become meaningless. I closed the door behind me with a determination I didn't understand, and stepped into the darkness of the night. The trees moved violently around me, their branches like claws trying to catch me. The rain soaked me, but it didn't matter. Somehow I felt like that storm was the only real thing in my life. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I just knew I couldn't go on living under that shadow. Aureliano's weight was crushing me, and I felt it was the only way to free myself. Maybe if I kept going, if I crossed that invisible line that separated my life from his, maybe I could start over. But as I walked, something changed. The rain, the wind, everything stopped mattering. My mind cleared and the truth unfolded before me, brutal and cold. I was not running from Aureliano. I wasn't running from those who were looking for him. I was running from myself. Today, sitting here while the storm seems to be raging, I can say that I am Aureliano. I don't know if I am still Pedro Jimenez. I don't know if I ever really was. But what I have learned in these 2 months is that when you face the consequences of what you have done, it doesn't matter how hard you try to escape. The footprints always catch up with you. It's strange, but now I understand the lesson I never wanted to see. No one escapes the storm, nor the footprints of what they have done. In the end, we are our own hunters. No matter who you are or who you call yourself, the truth always finds you. The storm continued its fury for hours, but the sound of the rain, which I had previously found unbearable, slowly began to calm down. The steady pounding on the roof became softer. like a distant song finally finding its end. In that stillness, I understood what I needed. The storm was not only an image of what had been, but also a harbinger of what I must face. That quest to escape, to strip myself of a life that was not mine, had brought me to a point of no return. But in the end, the storm had only been a manifestation of my own internal struggle. Like the rain, my memories and my fears would continue to fall on me, but no longer with the same destructive fury. I had accepted that Aureliano's imprint could not be erased. The truth is not something that can be evaded or changed, and although my identity has faded, the reality of what I did remains. In the end, storms are not just natural events. They are moments when our shadows meet the light. They are opportunities for growth, even if they frighten us and confront us with our own imperfections. And when the storm ceases, all that remains is calm, a calm that comes with the acceptance and understanding that in the end we cannot escape ourselves. The storm ended, and with it, so did my escape. Now I am who I am, and the rain has washed away the traces of a man who no longer exists. I am Johann, and if something is clear to me after what I lived through, it is that darkness can be much closer than one imagines. Maybe some people think that darkness is just a metaphor, a way of talking about fear or sadness, but I learned by force that there are people who feed it, who cultivate it. 5 months ago, I became a threat to those who think they are untouchable, and now I am here, in the middle of a storm, watching the raindrops crash against the window glass, as if the world is trying to wash it all away, but to no avail. The rain is so heavy that I can almost hear whispers in the noise it makes as it hits the glass. The trees bend under the weight of the wind, and through the gloom of the room, I see how the shadows lengthen, as if the environment itself is trying to devour me. The sound of the storm accompanies me, surrounds me, but what really torments me is not the weather, but what I experienced, what I saw. I was not always here, in this place away from the world, a place where isolation becomes a kind of shield. A few months ago, I had a different life in the city, surrounded by people, by everyday activities. But then something changed. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's enough to make your life fall apart. I remember it was a Thursday, a day like any other. I had an important meeting, something routine for someone working in the corporate sector. I had been invited to a small conference, supposedly to discuss future projects and investments. But I soon understood that this was not a simple business meeting. It was a carefully planned scenario, a play taking place behind the closed doors of an office with tinted windows, where everything that went on inside was not supposed to see the light. What on the surface appeared to be a conversation about growth and expansion strategies soon turned into a discussion about how to manipulate systems, corrupt officials, and eliminate those who stood in their way. There was corruption in every corner, in every word. I, who was just a spectator, was drawn into something much darker than I could have imagined. I saw what I was not supposed to see, heard what I was not supposed to hear, and in the blink of an eye, I was caught up in a game I had not chosen. At first I tried to ignore it, as if it was all a bad dream. I thought maybe I could go on with my life as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't a dream, let alone a bad dream. It was a nightmare. I knew it when the first knock on my door began. The sound of the doorbell was soft, but that vibration in the air hit me with the intensity of a direct blow to the heart. It was a knock I had never expected. No one was to know what I had witnessed. No one was to learn of the secrets I accidentally unveiled. Fear gripped me. I didn't understand the extent of what had happened, but I knew something was no longer right. The tension in my chest grew, and the rain began to fall that same afternoon, as if the sky also knew what was being unleashed. That night, hell began. There was a knock at the door, and though I didn't answer, I knew I would not be left alone. It wasn't just a simple threat. I couldn't trust anyone. No one was safe. Suddenly, I was caught in a web of persecution, of veiled threats, of furtive glances that knew everything and said nothing. The nights dragged on, and the shadows seemed to pursue me, lurking around every corner, not allowing me a moment's respite. In those moments, isolation ceased to be a refuge and became a prison. My life began to fall apart. Every day I felt the pressure mounting, the anxiety eating away at me little by little. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think clearly. My friends distanced themselves as if an invisible power had taken them away from me. No one seemed to understand the magnitude of what was happening, much less the reason for my flight. But I knew. I felt it. If I stayed in the city, if I didn't take action, they would find me. And then everything I had witnessed, everything I had heard would be lost forever. Life became a constant flight. I changed cities, changed my name, changed my appearance. Each new identity was one more layer I put on to protect myself from what I already knew was coming. But the fear was still there, unshakable. The nights were endless. The rain, always the rain, never stopped falling, as if the sky itself was washing the world to hide the truth. I felt I could not escape the storm that had begun inside me. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and though I tried to rest, though I told myself that I could not keep running forever, terror kept me on my toes. I knew that the men chasing me would not stop until they saw my corpse. The system I had witnessed was much larger and more powerful than I had imagined. They owned the city, the laws, the institutions. No one could protect me. Not the police, not friends. There was no hope. But then one afternoon something changed. Those who were chasing me made a mistake. They got complacent. They thought there was nothing I could do, that there was nothing left to do. It was then that, with the help of some unexpected people, I managed to do what seemed impossible before, to denounce everything I had seen. It was an act of desperation, a last attempt to fight, even though I knew it would not bring me back peace, security, or tranquility, but at least it would give me back something much more valuable, the possibility of breathing again. The day I went public with everything I had witnessed, I felt a momentary release, a sense of relief, as if a part of me had been shaken, even if I could not completely shake off the weight of fear. Although I'd put my life at risk in doing so, I had also opened a door to truth, to justice. The system that had persecuted me, the same corrupt system, began to shake. Although the repercussions of my denunciation were immediate and dangerous, I knew that at least I was no longer alone in my struggle. I was no longer afraid of what might come. The storm had stopped raging in my chest. Today, when I look back, I finally understand that the storm in my life was only the reflection of the storm in the hearts of those who believe they are untouchable, those who believe they can play with the lives of others, that they can destroy and manipulate as they please without consequence. Today, I can look at this storm as the rain continues to fall furiously, and at last I feel that, at least for an instant, the storm has stopped roaring in my chest. However, the peace I feel is only momentary. I know that the truth, even though it has been exposed, may yet cost me far more than it has already cost me. The price of what I have done may be higher than I imagine, but at the end of the day, in this world, there is one thing that is more precious than life itself: integrity. And though the storm continues to rage outside, inside me there is a calm, a peace that comes from knowing that at last, the echo of truth has begun to sound. The storm is a metaphor for what we all carry inside: fear, doubt, dark secrets. But when we finally let the truth emerge, when we face who we really are, it doesn't matter what it costs us. Peace is not the absence of storms, but the acceptance of them. Today I can say, with all certainty, that I survived the worst of myself. The real lesson in all of this is simple. To live is to face what we are, not what we wish to be. The storm always returns, but he who has faced its darkness knows that he can find calm even in the heaviest of rains. Sometimes peace is not achieved by escaping from chaos, but by embracing it, by seeing ourselves reflected in it, and in spite of everything, moving forward. The rain beats against the windows with relentless fury. Through the drops that slide on the glass, I see how the shadows of the night lengthen like invisible fingers, slowly approaching my dwelling. The wind is blowing hard, shaking the trees with a violence that makes my hair stand on end. The storm is at its peak, and with it, the feeling of discomfort that has invaded my life in recent months intensifies. It all started with a simple coincidence, a glance between colleagues, but soon turned into something much darker. Matthias, Fabian, and Bernardo. 3 names that used to be part of my life, of my daily routine, but now they are shadows that creep into every corner of my mind. Before, we were friends, or so I thought. We were inseparable, or so I thought. But something broke. Something inside me told me that everything wasn't like it used to be. At first, it was imperceptible. Strange comments, looks longer than necessary. I kept telling myself that I was overreacting, that my paranoia was playing a trick. But the truth was that something was changing in the way they were looking at me, as if they were studying me, analyzing my every move. The friendship, which we once shared, transformed into something much more dangerous, an unhealthy obsession. Matthias was the first to show his true face. He started with little innuendos, watching me silently while the others talked among themselves. There was something in his eyes, a spark of something I didn't understand. Fabian and Bernardo soon joined in, and together they formed a circle from which I could not escape. It didn't take them long to start pressuring me, manipulating me in ways I had never imagined possible. Everything was getting stranger and stranger. My life began to revolve around them, their whims, their expectations. They asked things of me, things I'd never considered, things I cringed just thinking about now. They started with what they called loyalty tests. They were simple challenges at first, small actions that were meant to prove that I belonged to them. Then they became more intense, more twisted. I can't explain how I came to give in. At the time, all I wanted was to avoid their wrath, which something inside me knew would be unstoppable if I refused. It wasn't fear at first, it was something much more insidious. They saw me as a piece in their game, a piece they had to control at all costs. I felt trapped in a maze with no way out, and as the pressure mounted, the decisions became more difficult. Their control over me was absolute. They were watching me all the time, always waiting for me to make the slightest mistake. They watched me, made sure I had no room to think, no room to hesitate. Every move I made, every word I uttered was under their scrutiny, and if they didn't like something, they didn't hesitate to punish me. The simple fact of looking at me differently could trigger a disproportionate reaction. I remember the first time I was forced to do something I wouldn't dare share with anyone. The pressure was such that I simply could not say no. It was not an isolated act, but one more step in their subjugation process. They knew how to manipulate me, how to play on my insecurities, how to make me feel I had no choice. Every time I thought I could break free, they pushed me again, deeper into their twisted world. And I, like a puppet, followed the strings that bound me. The feeling of hopelessness was overwhelming. The more I tried to escape, the more entangled I became in their grip. Hours turned into days, days into weeks, and in all that time I lost track of what was right and what was wrong. The rain continued to fall, and I was plunged deeper and deeper into darkness. My world began to shrink to what they wanted from me. Small victories of resistance quickly faded away as new demands were presented to me. It was as if, by giving in, everything returned to a state of equilibrium. But that equilibrium was nothing more than a mirage. I was no longer the same person as before. My identity vanished, replaced by their will, and it was then that I realized the truth. My life did not belong to me. I was under the absolute control of Matthias, Fabian, and Bernardo. I had lost everything I once valued: my autonomy, my dignity, my ability to choose. All that was left of me was a shadow of what I had been, a distorted reflection of the person I once walked with pride. Today, as I write this, the storm is still roaring outside the window. The rain seems to want to wash everything away, as if it wants to erase what happened, as if it wants to purify me of what I have lived through. But nothing can erase what I am now. There is no return. If I could warn others about what I lived through, I would tell them never to underestimate the capacity of humans to manipulate, to control, to destroy. Worst of all, you often don't realize what's happening until it's too late. The people in your life may seem harmless, but you never know what demons may be lurking deep in their minds. Sometimes, the real terror is not what is outside of you, but what others can do to you without you even knowing it. The rain may cover the sound of their footsteps, but it never erases the footprints they leave on your soul. And I, Pedro, am a victim of that footprint. A footprint that, although unseen, is deeper than I ever imagined. It's funny how, at some point, we want to fit in, to be part of something. But when we fall into the wrong hands, we soon realize that there's nothing worse than feeling like you're not yourself. And it doesn't matter how strong the storm outside is, the real storm is inside you. The rain was falling furiously that night, as if the sky itself wanted to wash something from the earth. Every drop that hit the roof of my car resounded with a relentless echo. accompanying the accelerated beating of my heart. I, Aureliano, used to dealing with the pressure of a tennis tournament final, had never felt such a crushing weight on my chest. It wasn't just the storm, it was the feeling of being caught up in something bigger, something dark and uncontrollable. It had all started in a mundane, almost insignificant way, after a quiet, uneventful family gathering. I parked my car under the dim yellow light of the streetlight at the end of the driveway as I always did. But that night, something broke the routine. As I opened the driver's door, my eyes met a daisy resting on the seat fresh, with droplets that looked as fresh as the rain itself. Next to it, a note written in hasty letters, "You're next." I didn't understand the meaning of those words. Next for what? My mind tried to rationalize it, a joke, a mix-up, a mistake, but something about the combination of the flower, a symbol of purity, and the threatening words chilled me to the bone. The street was empty. The shadows of the trees danced frantically in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone. I felt fear begin to infiltrate my system, turning the familiar into the strange. I decided I would not return home that night. My instinct, the one that had saved me so many times on the court, led me to a motel on the outskirts of town. Under the eerie flicker of blue neon, I tried to analyze the situation. I checked my phone, looking for any clues, but there were no suspicious calls, messages, or emails. I couldn't ignore what I felt. This was no simple accident. When I woke up the next morning, the fear I had tried to dispel during the night materialized again. A second daisy had appeared, this time on the windshield of my car. Next to it, another note. "Are you ready?" Panic turned to paranoia. How had they gotten there? How did they know where I was? My mind whirled between possible explanations, but none gave me clear answers. I went to the police. I tried to explain the situation, but their answers were vague and their looks were skeptical. They promised to investigate, but I felt they only offered me empty comfort. I realized I was alone in this. Days passed, and the daisies continued to appear, always accompanied by brief but increasingly disturbing messages. "We are watching you. You can't escape." The uncertainty became an unbearable weight. I stopped sleeping, eating well, even trusting the people around me. The rain, ever present, seemed to intensify my despair. It was as if the external storm mirrored the internal battle I was fighting. Then I began to notice a pattern. The messages, the places where the daisies appeared, all seemed related to my routine. The tennis club, the coffee shop where I ate breakfast, the park where I ran. Someone knew me on an intimate, frightening level. I came to the conclusion that I had to confront whoever was behind this. That night I decided to return to the tennis club, armed with a knife I had taken from my kitchen. In the pouring rain, the place looked more like a nightmare scenario than the familiar space where I had so often competed. The empty hallways amplified the echo of my footsteps, and the emergency lights cast elongated, ominous shadows. On the main court, I saw it, a perfect circle of daisies, and in the center, a new note. "You're here. Welcome to the game." A shiver ran down my spine. Before I could react, I felt a blow to the back of my head. The world vanished in an instant of pain and confusion. When I awoke, I was in an unfamiliar room. Tied to a metal chair, illuminated only by a bright spotlight that partially blinded me, I tried to understand where I was. In front of me, a wall covered with photographs. Each one was of me. Pictures taken secretly while I was eating breakfast, running, playing tennis. They were not just photographs, they were records of my life, evidence that someone had been watching me for a long time. The presence of someone else in the room was unmistakable. I couldn't see his face, but the weight of his gaze was palpable, oppressive. Time lost its meaning. Days seemed to fade into an endless cycle of fear and helplessness. Every time I closed my eyes, the daisies, the notes, and the photographs came back to haunt me. Finally, something unexpected happened. During one of her visits, whoever it was left the door ajar. With every shred of strength and determination I had left, I managed to break free and escape. I ran in the rain, not looking back, my heart pounding as if it would burst. I felt like the whole world was chasing me, but at least I was out of that room. Months have passed since that night. I moved to a distant city, changed my name, and stopped playing tennis. The person I was before was left behind, buried along with the constant fear that still haunts me. Although I haven't seen them again, I know they are there somewhere watching. And that's the scariest thing of all, the uncertainty of not knowing if I'm really free. In our daily lives, we take for granted that control is in our hands. We believe that our routines and decisions protect us from the unexpected. But Aureliano's story reminds us that sometimes the real terror comes not from supernatural forces, but from the threat posed by the human, the shadows that inhabit the other, the secrets that lurk in the silence, the games we don't know. Fear is not always tangible. It does not always have a face. It can be in a flower, in a note, in a look. But it is in those moments of extreme vulnerability that we also find our purest strength. Because even in the midst of the darkest rain, the hope of surviving and moving forward can become the spark that keeps the flame of our humanity alive. The first time I heard that voice, it was a night like this. Torrential rain pounded the windows with relentless fury, while lightning briefly illuminated the dark sky, unveiling a world transformed into shadows. The words echoed in my mind like a distant echo. "We are watching you." There was no face, no context, just a distorted voice that cut into my head like an icy blade. 25 days have passed since that call, and my life has lost any trace of normalcy. My days are a whirlwind of paranoia and isolation. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a prank, but with every detail that emerged, my skepticism crumbled. Something deeper, darker, was brewing in the shadows of my mind and environment. The first signs were almost insignificant. One early morning, I heard footsteps in the hallway of the building. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. The footsteps were soft, calculated, as if someone was measuring every movement. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty, as silent as ever. Then came the stairs, or at least the feeling of them. Even alone in my apartment, I felt that something or someone was there, hiding, lurking, waiting. The mailbox, which was always overflowing with useless bills and flyers, started to become empty. It wasn't something that caught my attention at first, but after days, the absence of any correspondence became unsettling. Had I disappeared from the outside world? As if my existence was being erased bit by bit. The envelope I found under my door was the confirmation I had feared. Inside, a photograph of me taken from a familiar corner of the city. The date stamped was 2 days before the call. A simple image, but loaded with implications. Someone was watching me before I even suspected. I couldn't pretend this was a coincidence. The photo was a statement, a clear message. We know where you are. The days that followed were a spiral of paranoia. I stopped leaving the house, unable to face what might be waiting for me beyond the door. The storm outside seemed eternal, a reflection of my inner state. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Every sound in the building made me jump off the couch. Every shadow on the walls seemed to move with hidden intent. The worst came when I discovered traces of activity on my phone that I hadn't caused. Messages sent to unknown numbers. Searches for places I'd never visited. Deleted emails. It was as if someone was manipulating my life from the other side of an invisible curtain. Finally, one night, the confinement became unbearable. I decided to go out in search of answers. I walked in the rain to the nearest police station, but once there, reality hit me. What was I going to tell them? I had no proof, just a photograph and my growing paranoia. I stood in front of the doors of the building for endless minutes, unable to enter. The thought of exposing my fear without solid backing paralyzed me. On the way home, I felt someone following me. The footsteps behind me were light but steady. My heart hammered in my chest, and although I dared not look back, my instinct told me I was being watched. I ran without looking, letting adrenaline guide me back to my apartment. That night, I blocked the door with everything I had at hand. I didn't sleep. The next morning, a new envelope appeared under the door. Inside, another photograph. This time, it was of me running in the rain, with a blurry figure in the distance following me. My paranoia reached its breaking point. I felt the very air of my home become thick, as if every corner was occupied by a presence I couldn't see. The storm outside seemed synchronized with my own fall. Each flash of lightning was a reminder of the inevitable. Then my phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Time to end the game. My whole body tensed. I had been waiting for it, but I wasn't ready. The weight of those words was unbearable. I decided to watch from the window, looking for a sign of what was to come. The rain, like an opaque veil, prevented me from seeing clearly. But then I saw it. A motionless figure across the street, completely oblivious to the downpour. I couldn't make out his face, but I knew he was looking directly at me. It was a silent confirmation that the game had reached its end point. I write these words with trembling hands. I feel that each passing moment brings me closer to a fate I cannot avoid. There is no escape, no plan that can stop the inevitable. This is my last testimony. If anyone finds these words, I want them to understand what I discovered. The real terror lies not in the unknown, but in the everyday. It is not the monsters under the bed, or the stories we tell ourselves in the dark. The real terror is the fragility of our perception of safety, the fine line that separates the normal from the overwhelmingly terrifying. When something as simple as a sound in the hallway or a photograph under the door destroys your sense of control, you understand how vulnerable we are. Fear doesn't need monsters. It just needs doubts, shadows, and the nagging sense that something or someone is just out of your reach. The rain keeps falling, but this time, I don't know if I'll see the sunrise. This reminds me how fragile our perception of security can be. In a world where we blindly rely on the stability of our daily lives, any small crack in that structure can bring it all crashing down. The real threat does not always come from the supernatural or the fantastic, but from the cracks in our minds and the way we interpret the world around us. Terror is not only that which lurks in the darkness, but the recognition that sometimes what we fear most may be closer than we imagine. The rain was falling heavily as if trying to erase the weight of the world, but only succeeded in intensifying it. Fairman walked through the soaked streets, with the water soaking through his clothes and each step echoing in his mind like an infinite echo. The darkness seemed to envelop him, an extension of the internal storm he had been dragging for more than a year. He knew that Juan was near, that his shadow was chasing him around every corner. There was no escape. There was no respite. There was only the slow and tormented advance towards an uncertain destiny. The first time Fairman noticed that something was wrong, it was subtle. A lingering stare in the subway, a figure at the back of a coffee shop, the constant feeling of being watched. At first, he thought it was paranoia. Perhaps, he told himself, the stress of work or routine was messing with his mind. But then the messages started. Notes in his mailbox with unconnected phrases, silent calls in the wee hours of the morning, little signals that always pointed to a presence behind him. That presence had a name, a face. Juan. Fermín did not know who he was or what he wanted, but it soon became clear that it was not a simple joke or a passing confusion. It was something deeper, darker. The first direct confrontation occurred months later in a park. Fairman recognized him immediately, tall, with an expressionless face, with an unsettling calm that paralyzed him instantly. There were no words, just a look that left him frozen. From then on, the macabre game began. Juan did not seek his death, at least not immediately. His goal was to break him, to plunge him into an abyss of fear and despair. Fairman's routine crumbled. He stopped visiting friends, stopped going out at night, stopped feeling safe even in his own home. He installed security cameras, changed the locks, and still, traces of Juan kept appearing. Sometimes a photo placed in impossible places, sometimes a message scrawled on his door. Once, she found her cat locked in the closet, meowing in despair. She knew he had been there. It was an invasion that went beyond the physical. It was about her mind, her stability. The previous week had been especially intense. Seeing one of the messengers in the cafeteria shook him deeply. Those seemingly ordinary men were Juan's pawns, his way of extending his influence beyond his physical presence. Fairman recognized them by their gaze, that spark of complicity that gave away their role in this perverse game. The rain that began that night was but the prelude to an even deeper descent. Each hit of the drops on her window seemed like a reminder that time was running out, that her world was getting narrower and narrower. He tried to run away, but soon realized he could not escape. The note on his car, so brief and final, was enough to return him to his prison. Juan was not only relentless, he was omnipresent. Fairman felt his presence even when he was not there. It was like a poison seeping into his thoughts, corrupting any attempt at normalcy. Days passed in a haze of fear, fueled by sleepless nights and an exhaustion he could not shake. His apartment had become a cell, and the rain didn't help, as if the outside world was conspiring to keep him trapped. But Fairman knew he couldn't go on like this. The photograph in the mirror was the breaking point. Someone had been in his house while he slept, had watched him, had immortalized him in that vulnerable state. That image tormented him, but it also ignited a spark inside him. He had to act. He could no longer remain a passive spectator in his own life. John had done everything possible to destroy him, but he still had something left. His will. Kitchen knife in hand, Fairman prepared for the inevitable. He had no clear plan, but he knew he had to face his fear, that specter that had dominated every aspect of his existence. The rain continued to fall, a constant curtain that cut him off from the world. The night seemed to go on forever, but inside him, something had changed. It was no longer just fear that he felt. There was a determination, a latent fury that had been waiting for this moment. When the moment came, it was not as he had imagined. Juan didn't show up in a dramatic way. There was no spectacular physical confrontation. Instead, it was a cold and silent encounter, as if they both knew that everything had led to this point. Fermín did not remember the exact details, only the frantic beating of his heart and the feel of the knife in his hand. He didn't know if he had won or lost, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to freedom. The storm ceased at dawn, and Fairman remained in his apartment, watching the first light of day filter through the curtains. There were no answers, no assurances that it was over, but there was something else, a sense that, at least for now, the game had changed. Maybe he would never know John's reasons. Maybe the horrors of that year would stay with him forever, but he had taken a step. He had taken control, if only for a moment. True monsters are not always supernatural creatures or distant entities. Often the deepest horror comes from those who walk among us, from the shadows cast by our fears. But it also shows something more important. Even in the darkest moments, when there seems to be no way out, there is always a spark of resilience within us. That spark, however small, can be enough to ignite a change, to reclaim our story and move forward. The rain may be endless, but each drop is also a reminder that we are still here, still fighting, one step at a time. The rain was falling with enormous force, an impenetrable curtain that enveloped the city in a wet and cold chaos. I walked hunched over, trying to protect myself under my soaked jacket, but it was useless. The water seemed to pierce the fibers of the fabric and freeze straight through my skin. The streets were deserted, except for the makeshift rivers that carried leaves and garbage. What seemed to be an ordinary rainy night would soon turn into one I would never forget. I have always been a forgettable face, someone who barely leaves an impression. Everywhere I went, whether in a supermarket line or at a bus station, people often mistook me for someone else. I didn't mind. After all, it was a common coincidence. That night, however, as I was crossing an empty avenue, everything changed. A black car slammed on the brakes a few meters away from me. The doors opened, and 3 men got out with a speed that put me on alert. Their movements were coordinated, their intentions clear, though unknown to me. Something in their looks, in their determination, chilled my blood. Instinct screamed at me to run, and I did. Puddles exploded under my feet as my footsteps echoed off the walls of the buildings. The rain not only hindered my vision, it also muffled the sounds, but I could hear the echoing footsteps of my pursuers. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted from me, but I understood that this was not a chance encounter. I turned into a narrow alley and slipped on the wet ground, falling to my knees. The pain was sharp, but the adrenaline forced me to get up. I kept running with my lungs burning and my legs shaking as the men's voices grew closer. I emerged from the alley just as a flash of lightning illuminated the square in front of me. There, like a beacon of hope, was a parked police car. Never before had I been so glad to see law enforcement officers. I ran toward them, waving my arms, soaking wet and panting. However, my relief evaporated in an instant when the policemen's guns were pointed at me. I didn't understand why they were treating me as a threat. I tried to explain to them that someone was after me, but their faces were hard and uncompromising. My confusion grew when the men in the black car appeared at the end of the square. The policeman's attention was diverted to them, and chaos ensued. The men fled to their vehicle as the officers gave chase. However, one of them stood still, watching me from a distance. His gaze was piercing, a silent promise that this was not over. Before I could react, I was handcuffed and loaded into the patrol car. In a matter of minutes, I went from being the victim to being treated like a criminal. I tried to explain my situation, but they didn't seem interested in listening to me. The only evidence they had was my face, and apparently that was enough to suspect me. At the police station, I was confronted with a series of photographs, unfamiliar faces, but one in particular caught my attention. It was a man who could have been my long-lost twin. We shared similar features, the same facial structure, the same tired look. According to the cops, this man was a wanted felon for violent crimes. I stared at his photograph in disbelief, trying to understand how someone who looked so much like me could have put me in this position. Gradually, I understood that this was not just a mix-up. Someone was using my identity, or worse, someone had engineered this whole thing to get me involved. I spent hours at the station, answering the same questions over and over again. Finally, they let me go, but not without a warning. I couldn't leave the city for the duration of the investigation. I went out into the streets under a rain that had lessened its fury but still kept soaking me, as if it wanted to remind me that the storm was not over. That night, I barely slept. The faces of the men who had chased me, the tension in the police station, and the photograph linking me to crimes I had not committed were all mixed together in a whirlwind of dark thoughts. The next morning, the world continued its usual routine, but for me, nothing was the same. I walked around feeling that everyone was watching me, that any stranger could be an enemy. That feeling of constant surveillance gnawed at me, a paranoia I could not control. A few days later, I found an envelope under my apartment door. Inside, there was a photograph of me, taken without me realizing it. I was walking down a street soaking wet from the rain. Next to the picture, a note that read, "We know who you really are." I felt the ground vanish under my feet. From that moment on, my life became an invisible pursuit. I didn't know who was looking for me or why, but fear settled in every corner of my existence. I avoided crowds, changed routes constantly, and watched every shadow. Every time I saw my reflection in a shop window, I remembered the photograph of the man who looked like me. I couldn't help but wonder if that coincidence was a quirk of fate, or if there was something darker behind it all. Looking back, I realize how fragile our identity is. All it took was a coincidence, a similar face, for my life to fall apart. It didn't matter who I really was, but who others thought I was. The weight of others' perceptions, suspicions, and unfounded accusations turned my reality into a nightmare. I lost confidence in the world around me, and worse, in myself. Today, as I write these lines, I try to understand what lesson lies behind this experience. Perhaps it is a warning about how our lives can change in an instant, how we are vulnerable to forces we do not understand. I also wonder how much power our appearance, our coincidences, have to define us in the eyes of others. Because in the end, we are not only what we think we are also what others see in us. The rain stopped long ago, but in my mind its echo persists. It accompanies me as a reminder that life is not always fair, that shadows can lengthen even under the sun. Now, every step I take is laden with caution. Every glance I cross carries the suspicion of latent danger. And though I try to move on, I know I will never be the person I was before that night. The storm left its mark, and its shadow will be my companion as long as my path lasts. 2020 marked the beginning of an adventure that promised to be the perfect escape from a life worn out by routine and urban chaos. Maria and I had spent too many years in the city, surrounded by constant traffic, gray skies, and a rhythm that gave no respite. The idea of moving to an isolated house in the countryside seemed like the ideal solution. We imagined quiet days, surrounded by nature, with the peace we had longed for. However, we never imagined what awaited us in that refuge. The house was beautiful. Its facade showed the wear and tear of the years, but that gave it a unique charm. Large windows allowed sunlight to flood every corner during the day, and the spacious grounds were bordered by a dense grove of trees that danced to the rhythm of the wind. We felt like we were in a dream, away from the hustle and bustle and worries, but that feeling was short-lived. The first few days were strange. The tranquility was such that it felt unnatural. We had assumed that a rural area would have its own sounds, animals, the occasional bustle of a small community. But there was nothing. Not a bark, not children's laughter, not even bird song at dawn. The only thing that broke the silence were the stares of the neighbors. Their eyes followed us in an inexplicable way, as if we were not welcome. Their faces, marked by work and time, showed no clear emotions, only constant vigilance. The man who seemed to lead this silent observation was unmistakable. Thin, with suntanned skin and a cold gaze, he was always present. I would see him from our window standing under a tree or by a fence, seemingly without purpose, but always watching. His presence made me uneasy, but I tried to justify it as simple curiosity of a rural inhabitant towards the newcomers. The initial tranquility began to break down with small occurrences that, at first, seemed like simple oversights. A screwdriver that disappeared from the shed, gloves that I left in the garden and never found again. I thought perhaps they had been lost during the move. However, the disappearance of more important things such as a set of keys or a portable lamp set off my alarm bells. Maria noticed it too, although we both tried not to make a big deal out of it, clinging to the idea that we were overreacting. One rainy night, the atmosphere in the house became especially oppressive. I went out into the garden to make sure the tools and other belongings were in order, and discovered something that made my heart stop. In the mud, right in front of our door, were fresh footprints. They were too big to be mine and headed straight for the house. I rushed back inside, checked every corner and every room, but found no one. Maria slept soundly, oblivious to my growing paranoia. That night I lay awake, listening to every creak, every gust of wind. The discovery of a rusty knife in the shed only fueled my unease. Although it was obvious it didn't belong to us, I didn't want to alarm Maria. I put it away in a drawer, trying to convince myself that it was of no great significance. But the air in the house felt heavier with each passing day. The nights especially were oppressive, with rain that seemed endless and darkness that became almost tangible. One early morning, as insomnia kept me awake, I heard footsteps downstairs. My breathing quickened. I grabbed a bat we kept near the bed and crept downstairs. The first floor was plunged into darkness, but the dim light of the flashlight I carried allowed me to make out a silhouette near the kitchen. I remained motionless, unable to move. I don't know if it was fear or an inexplicable intuition that made me back away. I went back to the bedroom, locked the door, and waited, my heart pounding violently. That night marked the point of no return. The rain pounded the windows hard, as if trying to warn us of something. While Maria slept soundly, I couldn't take my eyes off the bedroom door. Then I saw him. In the doorway, barely illuminated by the faint moonlight, stood the man who had been watching us since the first day. His figure was tall and thin, and his gaze, even in the gloom, was chilling. He stood there, motionless, for what seemed like hours, though it was probably only seconds. My body was paralyzed, unable to react. In an instant, the figure disappeared as if it had never been there. That was the last sign we needed. The next morning, I packed our belongings and convinced Maria to leave. There was no argument. In her eyes, I saw that she had felt something too, even though she never mentioned it. We left the house without looking back. We never went back and never wanted to know more. Memories of that house remained as an echo in our lives, a reminder that sometimes places that appear to be havens can hide something darker. But what was most disturbing was not the figure of the man, nor the strange happenings. It was what we discovered about ourselves in the midst of that loneliness. The final reflection came with time. I understood that it wasn't just the house that disturbed us. It was the isolation, the total disconnection from the world, that forced us to confront our own fears and demons. Sometimes, we seek peace in remote places, thinking that getting away from it all will solve our problems. But loneliness is not an escape, but a mirror that amplifies what we carry inside. That house still stands, empty, surrounded by the same trees that once whispered in the wind. Now I understand that we were not welcome there, not because something external rejected us, but because we ourselves carried the seed of our unrest. True peace is not found in isolation, but in reconciliation with oneself. The rain beat against the glass with an intensity that seemed to resonate with the agitation of my heart, reminding me that loneliness is sometimes not only a state, but a dark mirror that reflects what we fear to face. Living on the 9th floor of that old building, with its walls laden with stories and secrets, only accentuated that feeling. There was something in those walls that seemed to watch, to wait. But the biggest enigma was not in the building, but in that figure that materialized night after night in front of my window. It all began 10 months ago. It was a fleeting glimpse, a moment in which the light from the street lamp outside seemed to cast a shadow that, at first, I mistook for an optical trick. But that figure was not a trick of light or a wet spot. It was something more. As the nights passed, it became impossible to ignore it. It always returned, always to the same place, like a patient and persistent presence, waiting for me to be alone to reveal itself. The architect in me searched for rational explanations. I inspected every nook and cranny of the window, trying to find a flaw in the glass or a crack in the structure that might justify its appearance. However, there was nothing physical to explain that manifestation. Only the figure remained, motionless but penetrating, defying my understanding. What at first was bewilderment turned into obsession. I tried to ignore it, to concentrate on my daily routine, but its presence clung to my mind like a persistent shadow. The real blow came when I noticed something even more disturbing. The figure looked like me. It was not a perfect replica, but a distorted version, as if it were seeing me through a fogged glass that distorted my features. It was my face, but with an expression of agony, with eyes sunken in shadows and a rigid jaw that seemed to contain silent screams. The question that began to invade me was simple but devastating. What did that figure want from me? As I tried to find answers, I remembered something that had remained buried in my memory. During my childhood, my parents had mentioned a brother I had never met, an older brother whose existence was treated as a taboo subject. He was not spoken of beyond vague references. The uncertainty of his fate had always troubled me, but over time I learned not to ask. Now, with that figure haunting me, the fragments of that lost history took on new meaning. I began to investigate. My mother, always evasive, offered ambiguous answers, and my father seemed even more reluctant to talk about it. However, I found clues among old documents, letters with no return address, a yellowed photograph of a young man who shared my features. It was he, my brother, a stranger whose presence seemed as close and distant as the figure in my window. I realized that my search was not only for answers, but also to understand the connection between us. Each discovery deepened my anguish. I learned that my brother had left the family home voluntarily, but the reasons for his departure remained nebulous. His disappearance had left scars on my parents, scars that never fully closed. As I looked at that old photograph, something in their eyes was disturbingly familiar. I couldn't shake the idea that he was near, that somehow he wasn't completely gone. The nights became even more tense. A storm seemed to be forming inside me, reflecting the steady rain that pounded against the windows of my home. It was then that something happened that I will never forget. As I was driving home in the pouring rain, I felt a presence behind me. Without turning around, I knew I was not alone. The air in the car became heavy, charged with something I couldn't describe. I finally mustered the courage to look in the rearview mirror, and there he was, a man, pale, with eyes that looked like empty sockets, watching me from the back seat. The figure was not a specter or a hallucination. It was real. It was my brother, the man who had disappeared decades ago. The silence between us was deafening. No word was spoken, but his gaze contained a mixture of reproach and despair. I took him home, as if something stronger than my will compelled me to do so. His presence filled my space, not only physically but emotionally. Every corner of my home seemed to claim his existence, and my life ceased to be my own. Day after day, her presence became unbearable. Not because she was violent or aggressive, but because she seemed to invoke an abyss within me that I was afraid to explore. His arrival was no mere coincidence. He was looking for something I could not offer him. Redemption, perhaps, or a restitution of the place he felt had been taken from him. The weight of his gaze, of his silence, was a constant reminder of decisions made by others, decisions that shaped our lives in ways neither of us chose. Finally, the collapse came. One night, the tension exploded in a confrontation that left wounds deeper than any physical blow. It was a chaos of pent-up emotions, of shared and unresolved blame. Police intervention put an end to our confrontation, taking him to a psychiatric facility where they assured he would be better cared for. But for me, nothing was ever the same again. Months later, the figure still appears in my window, although its meaning has changed. I no longer see it as an intruder or a threat, but as a reminder. I understood that it was not my brother who was stalking me, but myself. He was the reflection of my fears, of my decisions not made, of the parallel lives I never lived. He and I were two sides of the same coin, both shaped by a past we could not choose. The rain continues to pound on the glass, setting a steady rhythm that seems to synchronize with my inner self. I now understand that our shadows are not enemies, but parts of ourselves that need to be recognized. The figure has not disappeared, but neither has the man I am. Both coexist, and in that coexistence I find something akin to peace. Each of us is a reflection of our choices, our experiences, and the lives we were not able to live. The shadows that accompany us are not external entities, but fragments of ourselves that cry out to be heard. We cannot run away from them because they are our teachers, showing us what we need to face in order to grow. True freedom lies not in avoiding what torments us, but in accepting our imperfections and learning to live with them. In the end, we are neither victims nor executioners of our story, but the storytellers who choose how to interpret it. The rain pounded against my window like a storm of bullets, the incessant sound piercing the silence of my small apartment. It had been an exhausting day in the newsroom. Games, analysis, endless notes. Being a sports writer wasn't the life of intrigue I once dreamed of, but the stability it offered was enough to keep me busy. I was just finishing my dinner when the phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. I thought about ignoring it. It wasn't uncommon to receive erroneous calls or messages from fans obsessed with some player, but something, perhaps the tedium of the routine, made me answer. On the other end, I heard a female voice, desperate, broken by fear. She asked me for help. It was only a few words, but each one of them stuck in my mind like a dark echo that I could not ignore. Before I could say anything, the line went dead. I froze, the rain outside intensifying as if reflecting my confusion. I tried to call back, but the number was out of service. That woman's voice kept echoing in my head. Her plea was so raw, so urgent that it cut through me. I wondered if it was a prank, a mistake, or something darker. I wasn't someone who obsessed easily, but that night I didn't sleep. His words haunted me like a shadow. The next day, in an attempt to clear my mind, I went out early. The rain was still falling, softer but steady. The gray of the sky tinged the city with a heavy melancholy. It was then that I saw her for the first time. She was in the coffee shop across the street from the newsroom, a dark-haired woman with eyes full of a sadness she couldn't hide. There was something about her that looked familiar, though I couldn't identify what. I ordered my coffee, and before I could approach her, she disappeared into the crowd. That fleeting encounter left me uneasy. I went back to work, but my mind kept returning to her. Something in her movements, in her gaze, told me she was the same woman from the phone call. It was absurd. She could be anyone, and yet I felt there was a connection I couldn't ignore. Later that night, I checked the call logs and tried to trace the number, but found nothing. My concern grew. I began to investigate casually, checking local news outlets for something, anything that would give me a clue. It wasn't until 2 days later that I saw the headline, "Woman murdered in her apartment. Police suspect robbery." The accompanying photo confirmed what I already knew. It was her. The case was as simple as it was baffling. According to reports, someone broke into her home during the wee hours of the morning. There were no witnesses, no suspects. The authorities were talking about a burglary gone wrong. But something didn't add up. That call was no coincidence. She knew something was going to happen to her. I tried to get help, and for some reason I was the person she chose. Guilt began to consume me. I felt like I should have done something, anything. I knew nothing about her, not even her name, until I read it on the news. Sophia. But now it was as if her death somehow belonged to me. My life began to revolve around finding answers. I went through every article, every detail of the case. Nothing fit. I couldn't trust the official version, let alone the indifference of the police. I began to discreetly ask around the area where I lived, looking for clues. The neighbors were cautious, evasive. There was something they didn't want to tell me, or perhaps something they feared. It was during these inquiries that I began to notice something strange. I felt I was being followed. Every time I went out into the street, there was a car that seemed to always be nearby. A man with an umbrella who never stopped watching me. At first, I thought it was my paranoia, but it didn't take me long to realize it was real. Someone was watching my every move. One day, while going through some notes in my office, I found an envelope slipped under my door. It had no return address, but the contents left me cold. A photograph of me taken from the street walking to my apartment. Next to it, a brief message, "Stay away." The threat was clear. For a moment, I considered giving it all up. I wasn't a hero, far from it. I was just a sports writer with an obsession that had taken a dangerous turn. But guilt was stronger than fear. I knew Sophia had died because no one listened to her, because no one did anything. If I didn't do something, it would be like letting her die again. My nights became a mixture of insomnia and constant vigilance. I changed routes every time I went out, checked the locks 3 times before going to sleep. But the feeling of being watched never went away. That's when the inevitable happened. I was attacked. One night, as I was walking home in the rain, someone stepped out of the shadows. I barely saw the glint of a knife before I was thrown against a wall. It was quick, violent. I was left lying on the ground, bleeding, with a clear message: don't mess where you don't belong. After the attack, I knew I was closer to the truth than I thought. My obsession was not just a desperate search for answers. It was now a matter of survival. What I discovered in the days that followed confirmed the worst. Sophia was not randomly murdered. She had been involved in something bigger, something that threatened to drag me down as well. I found documents online, leaks of information that connected her name to a web of corruption involving high-profile politicians and businessmen. His death was not a robbery gone wrong, it was an execution. My movements became more cautious. Every step I took, every person I talked to could be a fatal mistake. I didn't know who to trust. Even my colleagues in the newsroom seemed to look at me with suspicion. I felt isolated, caught in a web I couldn't untangle. One day, as I was going through the latest files I had gotten my hands on, I realized something frightening. My name was there. It had been added recently. I was now part of the game. I wasn't just someone doing research, I was a target. The day it all ended, the rain was heavier than ever. The thunder rumbled like distant warnings, but I couldn't stop. I knew my time was running out. I had managed to gather enough evidence to connect the dots, to expose who was behind it all. But I knew I wouldn't get far. It was too big for someone like me. That night, I received the final threat, an anonymous call, a voice that told me what I already knew: run while you can. But I didn't run. I handed over the evidence to a trusted contact, someone outside my circle, and waited. I knew they would come for me, and they did. In the middle of the storm, footsteps in the hallway mingled with the drumming of the rain. I closed my eyes, ready for whatever was coming. I couldn't save myself, but at least I had done something for Sophia, something for the truth. Time has passed since that night. I'm not dead, but I'm not quite alive either. I live with the weight of what happened, with the visible and invisible scars. The evidence I gave came to light, but not enough. Those responsible are still free, although some familiar faces have fallen from grace. What I learned is that the real terror is not the monsters in the dark or the ghosts of our fears, but people. The decisions we make, the silences we keep, the truths we ignore. Every action has a price, and sometimes that price is our life. But there is something worse than dying, living knowing that you could have done something and you didn't. When I decided to move, I never thought that decision would change my life in this way. It was a necessary change, an opportunity to leave behind a stage of exhaustion and monotony. The house was modest, but it had its charm. The wooden floors creaked, the walls were thick and solid, and from my bedroom window I could see the city stretching out like a blurry painting under the constant blanket of rain that never seemed to leave this part of the world. At first, everything was normal. The first few weeks passed with the usual chaos of unpacking boxes and adjusting to a new place. The daily routine helped me not to think too much about the shadows that seemed to lengthen in the evenings, nor the sound of the rain that never stopped, like a constant drumming on the roof. But that tranquility was broken one morning. It was something small, insignificant in appearance. As I stepped out of the shower, I noticed something written on the fogged mirror. At first, I thought it was a bad joke from some previous neighbor. A word scrawled with my finger. It said, "Beware." I frowned, wiped the towel across the mirror, and the word disappeared. I didn't think anything of it. I chalked it up to humidity and my imagination playing tricks on me. The next few days, the messages continued, each time clearer, more detailed. Back door, window open. Someone is watching you. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was traces of moisture building up in a peculiar way, but it didn't take long for my mind to slip into paranoia. I checked every corner of the house, every window, every lock. Everything was in order. There was no indication that anyone had entered, but I couldn't deny what I saw. The weather didn't help. The rain was relentless, as if it wanted to envelop me in a feeling of claustrophobia. Moisture seeped through the walls, and the days seemed tinged with permanent gray. Every time I left the house, I felt someone's eyes following me from the shadows, and when I returned, the fear of finding another message left me paralyzed. It was on one of those nights, as the storm raged outside, that I found the message that chilled my blood. He is near. This time, it wasn't a simple scribble. It was a message written with chilling precision, as if it had been carved with the tip of a knife. My breathing became erratic as I scoured the house with knife in hand, but I found no one. I decided to investigate the house further. My logic told me there had to be a rational explanation. I went to the land registry, looked through old records, and that's when I discovered something that left me cold. The previous owner of the house, a man named Diego Luna, had been committed to a correctional facility 5 years ago for multiple murders. He was a known psychopath, someone who had used the house as his base of operations. Most disturbingly, he had escaped a few months ago. No one knew where he was. My mind connected the dots immediately. What if Diego was back? What if he was playing games with me, stalking me from the shadows as he made a mockery of my life? That night, I didn't sleep. I locked the doors, barred the windows, and lay awake with a bat in my hands, waiting for a noise, a movement, something to tell me I wasn't alone. The days became hell. The messages in the mirror went on and began to include details that disturbed me deeply. Under the bed. Don't go out today. He knows. Every word was a dagger in my mind, and paranoia became my only companion. I hired a locksmith to reinforce all the entrances, installed security cameras, but nothing seemed enough. The fear was constant, like a slow poison infiltrating my system. One evening, while reviewing the camera recordings, I saw something that paralyzed me. During the night, while I was sleeping, someone had broken into the house. He had not broken the locks or forced the windows. He simply appeared, as if he had the key. The figure was tall, thin, dressed in a black raincoat. His face was hidden by the hood, but something about his posture was alarmingly familiar. He walked through the house calmly, as if he were in his own home, and stopped in front of the bathroom mirror. There, he wrote something that I couldn't read at the time. Then he vanished into the darkness. Panic consumed me. I stopped going out, stopped working. My life became a constant state of alert. But the worst was yet to come. One night, during a particularly violent storm, the electricity went out. The house was in total darkness, illuminated only by flashes of lightning. It was then that I heard footsteps. Slowly, they were ascending the stairs. My breathing stopped. I was paralyzed with fear, knowing that this time it wasn't a recording or my imagination. He was here. I grabbed the knife I always kept close and hid behind my bedroom door. The footsteps stopped just outside. I held my breath as I listened to the creak of the door slowly opening. A figure appeared in the doorway, his dark silhouette against the glow of lightning. I did not wait. I threw the knife with all my might, listening to the scream of pain that followed. I took the opportunity to run for the exit, but something stopped me. The bathroom mirror was in front of me, and on its fogged surface was a final message. Too late. When the police arrived, they found traces of blood but no sign of the intruder. The cameras had been disabled, and the door locks showed no signs of tampering. My statements were met with skepticism, and I didn't blame them. It all seemed so absurd, so unreal. But I knew the truth. I did not go back to that house. I left everything I had behind and moved to a place where no one could find me. But the paranoia wouldn't leave me. Every time I go into a bathroom, I check the mirror. Every time I hear footsteps behind me, my body tenses. The rain, which I once found soothing, is now a constant reminder of that night. Diego Luna is still free. I don't know if he's looking for me, if he's still playing with my mind from a distance. But there is something I learned in all this. The real terror is not in the supernatural, but in the human. People are capable of things that not even monsters could imagine. And when danger hides behind a familiar face, there is no place where we can truly feel safe. The mirror does not lie. It only reflects what is already there, waiting for us. I have never been a superstitious person. I have always believed that the chaos of life is random, with no predictable patterns or hidden signs. But since that rainy afternoon, everything changed. My name is Libardo, and I have been living for 6 years with a certainty as disturbing as the constant rain in my memories. Someone is following me. It all began in a crowded square, a place that any other day would have been a refuge of anonymity. It was a gray afternoon with heavy clouds foreshadowing the storm that would break minutes later. I happened to be there, waiting for a colleague for coffee, when it happened. The shot rang out above the noise of the crowd. In an instant, the bustle turned to chaos. People ran in all directions, dropping umbrellas and bags, creating a patchwork of colors and puddles on the wet pavement. My first impulse was to turn toward the source of the sound, and that was my mistake. I saw it. A man in a dark suit, with a stiff posture and a black umbrella, was standing next to a woman's body. Blood mingled with the rainwater running down the cracks in the pavement. The killer did not run away, did not show panic. He slowly turned his head and looked me straight in the eyes. I will never forget that look. It was not one of threat or hatred, but of recognition, as if he had been looking for me. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I testified before the police along with dozens of other witnesses. The officer in charge tried to reassure me that the man had been arrested, that everything was under control. But something didn't add up. I felt that the danger was not over, although I did not understand why. I didn't know the woman or the man who had killed her. She was just another witness in the crowd. Or so he thought. That same night, as the rain pounded on the windows of my apartment, I noticed something strange. From my living room, I could see a man standing under the streetlight in front of my building. He had a black umbrella, just like the one I saw in the plaza. I thought it was a coincidence, but when I went out to check, it was gone. Only a puddle remained where it had been. The following days were no better. I began to notice small changes in my routine. A car parked in front of my house for hours, a figure that seemed to follow me when I walked to work. At first, I convinced myself it was paranoia, a reaction to what I had witnessed. But the coincidences became patterns, and the patterns became certainties. The man with the black umbrella appeared everywhere. I saw him at the train station, standing at the end of the platform. I saw him in the supermarket, pushing an empty cart. He was always there, but he never approached, never made contact. His presence was enough to eat away at my peace of mind. I decided to investigate on my own. I checked the news about the case, looking for something to connect me to it. I discovered that the murdered woman was a journalist investigating a corruption ring. The man arrested had been identified as a hitman, someone hired to silence her. But what did it have to do with me? Time brought no answers, only more questions. One night, while going through my emails, I found one I didn't remember sending. It was in my sent items tray, addressed to an address I didn't recognize. It contained a series of attachments with names that suggested financial reports and private emails. I did not open them. I feared that somehow I had become involved in something much bigger than I could understand. The feeling of being watched intensified. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was in my apartment. I would check every room, every lock, but everything was in its place. However, the certainty that I was not alone accompanied me constantly. One rainy day, just like the one in the square, I took courage and faced my fear. I walked towards the man with the black umbrella who was standing on a corner near my office. My footsteps echoed on the wet pavement and my heart hammered in my chest. When I was a few feet away, he raised his head and looked at me. It was then that I understood. He wasn't the hitman who had killed the woman. He was not an undercover police officer, not just another witness to the crime. This man was there for me. His gaze was different from that day in the square, but just as penetrating. Before I could get any closer, he turned around and disappeared into the crowd. That night, I sat in front of my bathroom mirror and faced a disturbing truth. Everything that had happened, from the plaza to the documents in my mail, seemed to converge on a single idea. Someone wanted me to be involved. Maybe I was chosen at random. Maybe there was something in my life that made me an easy target. But now it was too late to escape. Days turned into years, but the uncertainty never went away. I quit my job, changed cities, and even tried to build a new life. But the shadow of the man with the black umbrella always found me. Sometimes I saw him from afar. Other times he was a reflection in a window or a figure in the crowd. He never spoke to me, never touched me, but his presence was a constant reminder that something bigger was at stake, something I would never fully understand. Now, 6 years later, I have accepted that my life is marked by this enigma. I don't know if I will ever get answers, but I have learned to live with the questions. Every raindrop that falls reminds me of that day in the square when it all began, and makes me wonder if my life would have been different if I hadn't turned towards the shot. This is not only a story of my life as a moment that could have changed everything, but also a metaphor for the shadows we carry without fully understanding them. Often we find ourselves trapped in patterns or circumstances that seem alien, but somehow shape us. The rain had started early that night, pounding furiously on the windows of my small apartment. The neighborhood, usually quiet, looked like a desert under the curtain of water. My name is Fernando, and until 2 months ago I lived in routine calm. Everything changed with the arrival of Daniel, the new neighbor in 3B. He was a reserved man, perhaps too reserved. Tall, thin, and with a somber look, Daniel looked like a black and white painting. His movements were precise, as if he measured every step, every glance. I never saw him interact with anyone except me when he arrived the first day and asked for help moving a heavy piece of furniture. "I have no family," he said, a simple sentence that didn't mean much at the time, but now it reverberates in my mind with another burden. The first few weeks there was nothing strange, or maybe I didn't know how to see it. But then I started noticing things. Daniel wasn't following a normal schedule. I would see him out in the early morning, always dressed in a black jacket and a cap that hid part of his face. He would return at dawn, as if the sun were an enemy he preferred to avoid. What disturbed me most was the sound. At night I would hear noises coming from his apartment. They weren't loud knocking or arguing, but something much more subtle, like dragging furniture, like moving something heavy back and forth. My curiosity, mixed with a growing uneasiness, began to gnaw at my peace of mind. One night, when the rain was so heavy that the lights were flickering, I decided to watch him from my window. I watched as he came out of the building with a duffel bag over his shoulder. It was big, heavy, so much so that he had trouble carrying it. He walked to his car, a dark sedan that never seemed to park in the same spot, and tossed the bag into the trunk with obvious effort. I couldn't help but wonder what he was carrying in that bag. But what I saw the next day made my blood run cold. On the morning news, they showed a picture of a missing man. I recognized him instantly. He was the delivery man from the local pizza place. The news report mentioned that he had last been seen near our building. That's when the coincidences began. Or maybe it was more than that. Every time someone disappeared in the city, I remembered Daniel's movements, the night noises, the duffel bags. Was I overreacting? Was my mind playing tricks on me? But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was deeply wrong. One night, I decided to approach his door, just to listen. Under the sound of the rain, I sensed something. It was a metallic sound, a continuous scraping. I held my breath as I tried to identify it. My heart was pounding so hard I feared he could hear it from the other side. I moved away before he could become aware of my presence. My obsession with Daniel grew. I started taking notes, looking for anything that might confirm my suspicions. I checked online for his name, but found nothing. It was as if he didn't exist before he moved here. I tried to remember if he had ever mentioned anything about his past, but he had not. Then one day I made a mistake. While rummaging through the building's trash, looking for something that might connect him to the disappearances, I found an envelope. It was empty, but it had his address and a return address I didn't recognize. I took it home, thinking maybe I could trace something. I didn't realize he had seen me. From that moment on, everything changed. I began to feel watched. When I left for work, I noticed that his car seemed to follow me at a safe distance. The lights in my apartment flickered more frequently, as if someone was tampering with something. My phone would ring in the middle of the night, but when I answered it, I only heard the sound of rain on the other end of the line. One night, as I was writing in my journal, I heard a rattling noise in my door lock. My body tensed. I approached cautiously, kitchen knife in hand, but there was no one on the other side. I did, however, find a note slipped under the door. It had only one sentence: "Stop looking, Fernando." The storm that night was deafening. I sat by the window, trying to gather my thoughts, but I knew it was too late. I had crossed a line in trying to find out who Daniel was, and now I was sure I was his next target. Fear became a constant. I began to sleep with the lights on, though I could barely get any rest. Every time I heard a noise, I thought it was him entering my apartment, so I made a decision to run away. But it wasn't that simple. I felt that Daniel knew my every move. The night I planned to leave, the rain came down harder than ever. As I was walking down the stairs with my suitcase, I saw him. He was at the end of the hallway, standing, looking at me. He didn't say anything, just watched me. I dropped the suitcase and ran for the exit. Outside, the rain was an impenetrable wall, but I didn't stop. I ran until my legs could run no more, until the neighborhood was behind me and I found myself in an unfamiliar place. That was the last time I saw Daniel. I never went back to my apartment. I left everything behind, my job, my friends, my life. But the paranoia never left me. Every time I hear the sound of rain, I feel he is near, watching me from the shadows. Sometimes I think about what I learned from all this. We live surrounded by strangers, we share walls, roofs, streets, but we never know who they really are. Perhaps it is not necessary to know the secrets of others. Maybe, in our attempt to discover the truth, we only find something we can never forget. And sometimes, like the rain, there are things that we simply have to let fall and move on. My name is Eric. Until that morning, my life had been as routine as anyone could imagine. But everything changed when I woke up to discover a trail of blood starting at my front door and extending into the woods behind my house. The rain, heavy and steady, flooded the air with the pungent smell of damp earth and iron. My heartbeat quickened as I took in the scene, water droplets mingling with crimson stains on the cobblestone floor. My initial instinct was to close the door and pretend I hadn't seen anything, as if ignoring the situation might make it go away. However, an inexplicable force, a mixture of curiosity and an unsettling sense of responsibility, compelled me to follow that trail. Wearing a raincoat and boots, I set out into the storm, facing a path that I didn't know where it would lead me. The trail was unmistakable despite the rain that slowly diluted it. It led down the gravel road, across the field, and into the nearby forest. Every step I took felt as if an inner voice was warning me to turn around, but I didn't. It was as if something higher was guiding me. It was as if something higher was guiding my feet, a will that did not belong to me. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, I found it. There, among the tall dark trees, lay Clara's body. Her silhouette stood out against the wet ground, her eyes open as if she were still looking up at the gray sky. The scene was haunting and heartbreaking. I recognized her face immediately. Clara was a well-known neighbor, though not particularly well-liked in the neighborhood. Not because of what she had done, but because of the circumstances in which she lived. The arguments in her house were legendary. Her husband, Victor, had a reputation for being an aggressive man, unable to control his temper. Shouting and the sounds of banging furniture were common, even on nights like this one, when the rain seemed to deafen the world. The police had visited her home more than once, but Clara always denied any problems, hiding the marks of her suffering with excuses and long sleeves. Now in front of her limp body, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming weight of guilt. I never got involved. None of us did. We thought it was enough to mumble our concerns at occasional meetings or look the other way. Clara, with her cracked voice and forced smile, would convince us that there was nothing to fear. But here she was, alone, in the middle of the forest, lifeless. I approached slowly, my throat dry and my hands trembling. The rain was falling furiously, but my mind was focused on the details. There were no visible signs of aggression, except for a small cut on his head that appeared to have been caused by a fall. However, near her hand, I found something that chilled my blood. A silver heart-shaped pendant, crushed as if someone had stepped on it hard. I remembered seeing it around her neck before, an object that seemed important to her. The forest, normally a peaceful place, seemed oppressive under the storm. I felt every shadow watching me, every rustle of branches making me turn sharply. I knew I should call the police, but fear paralyzed me. What if someone had deliberately left the body there? What if they were watching me, assessing how I reacted? I walked home with hurried steps, the pendant clenched in my hand. I closed all the doors and windows as if I could insulate myself from the growing sense of danger. That night I could not sleep. The sound of the rain was a constant reminder of what I had seen. My mind spun to Clara, her husband, and the times we as a neighborhood chose not to intervene. Days later, the police arrived in the neighborhood. Their questions were clear. Had we seen anything unusual? I kept silent about the blood trail and the pendant. I didn't know why I was doing it, but I felt that revealing what I knew would put me in an even more vulnerable position. However, my silence did not protect me. I began to notice strange things. One night, my door, which was secured, appeared ajar. Another, I thought I saw a silhouette in the rain outside my window. I ran to look, but no one was there. Paranoia took hold of me, turning my house into a prison. The neighbors also seemed distant, as if they knew something I did not. Days later, a letter arrived with no return address. Its words were few but blunt. "We know what you did." The message, though confusing, reinforced my sense of being in danger. Who was watching me? What did they want from me? My world, once drab and predictable, was now tinged with shadows and suspicion. The pendant remained in my possession, a symbol of what I had not done. I wondered if turning it over to the police could close this chapter, but I feared what it would mean for me. Every time I looked at it, I remembered Clara's face, her eyes that seemed to ask for help, even when she denied needing it. I felt the object was a burden and a condemnation. Days turned into weeks, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every creak in the house, every fleeting shadow reminded me that I was not alone. Guilt, like a slow poison, infiltrated every corner of my mind. I was not the killer, but neither was I innocent. I had chosen to ignore, and that indifference had made me complicit in his fate. Now I write these words as the rain pelts my window again. The sound, once comforting, is now a reminder of all that I have lost, of all that I never did. I don't know if this will be my last night. Maybe the killer will come for me, or maybe it will be my own guilt that ends up consuming me. In life, doing nothing in the face of the suffering of others is a choice, and that choice has consequences. Silence, many times, can be as destructive as an act of violence. We tell ourselves that it is not our problem, that we cannot change what someone else does not want to face. But that attitude makes us accomplices, passive observers of tragedies that we could have prevented. This experience taught me that ignoring does not exempt us from responsibility. Indifference is a silent weapon, and every time we look the other way, we contribute to the burden that others carry. If I learned anything from Clara, it is that small actions can make a difference. No matter how uncomfortable or difficult it is to intervene, choosing not to do so can cost lives. The night that changed my life began with a torrential rain that transformed the city into a bleak, watery landscape. The drops, fierce and constant, lashed the buildings as if they wanted to wear away every last corner of stone. From my small apartment, I watched the scene as the phone vibrated on the table, an insistent echo reminding me of the gravity of my actions. My world, built on calculated risks and reckless gambles, was beginning to crumble like a house of cards. I am Carrasco, and for years I considered myself untouchable, a clandestine bookmaker with a gift for manipulating numbers, reading intentions, and exploiting human weaknesses. It was a dangerous game, but one that had given me more than one victory. I liked to think I was invincible, that I would always find a way to come out on top. That night, however, I discovered that arrogance has a price few are willing to pay. The message I received was not just a reminder of my debts, but an inescapable summons. The amount I owed was not small, and the warnings of those men were no longer vague threats. I knew what happened to those who did not comply. With my heart clenched in fear, I headed for the right place, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts next to the river. The walk in the rain was a prelude to what was to come. Each step was heavier than the last, as the storm intensified the feeling of isolation and despair. I arrived at the warehouse drenched and shivering, but not from the cold. The structure, weather-worn and damp, stood like a soulless giant. Inside, the gloom was broken only by a weak hanging light that created distorted shadows. A group of men waited for me. Their dark suits and stiff postures seemed to absorb all the light, as if they were part of the same gloomy environment. Their faces, largely hidden, were masks of indifference and power. One of them, the leader, advanced with a calculated movement, extending a piece of paper to me. There were no words, only symbols, a knife, a cage, and an hourglass. The implications of these drawings quickly became clear as I was led into an adjoining room. There, a man was tied to a chair. His face was swollen, covered with bruises and streaked with tears. The despair in his eyes was a mirror of the abyss I faced. I did not know him, but his suffering became my burden. On a nearby table, a knife gleamed in the dim light, and an hourglass began to slowly empty. The task was clear: do as I was ordered, or suffer even worse consequences. The rain was still pounding on the roof like a war drum, marking the rhythm of my chaotic thoughts. There was no way out. I tried to cling to the idea that this would be the last time I would be caught up in something like this. But even then, I knew it was a lie. As I picked up the knife, I felt that its weight was not that of steel, but of my own cowardice. I can't remember all the details of what happened next. My mind has erased parts of that memory, perhaps as a defense mechanism, but the guilt never went away. When it was all over, I staggered out into the storm. The drops falling on my hands seemed to wash away the blood that wasn't there physically, but felt like an indelible stain on my soul. The next few days were a silent hell. The calls and threats stopped, but my inner torment was just beginning. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every shadow in the night, every creak in the apartment was a sign that they would come for me. But they didn't. They didn't need to. The burden they left on me was far worse than any physical punishment. The price of my decisions began to spread like a destructive wave. My father, whose health was already deteriorating, could not stand the pressure of the threats and died of a massive heart attack. My mother and sister, terrified of possible reprisals, were forced to flee the country. Each loss was a reminder of the monster I had become, of the line I crossed in that warehouse. Years have passed, but the echoes of that night remain. Sometimes when the rain hits the roof hard, I close my eyes and stand there again, the knife in my hands and the hourglass marking the end of my humanity. I wonder if I could have done something different, if I would have had the strength to face the consequences differently. But questions do not change the past. They only illuminate it with painful clarity. Today, 3 years later, I have left the gambling world behind. I try to rebuild my life, although the rubble of my past decisions still surrounds me. I work quietly, seeking to redeem myself in small but meaningful ways. Helped out at a local shelter, trying to give back some of what I took away from the world. However, the shadow of that night remains my constant companion. The final message I want to share is this: every decision we make has a cost. We often underestimate that price, believing we can escape the consequences. But life has a way of balancing the books, and sometimes it does so relentlessly. Don't gamble with what you can't control. Don't risk crossing lines you can never undo. Because when you lose, you don't just risk your money, your position, or your relationships. You can also lose something much more valuable: your soul, your essence, that which makes you human. Redemption is possible, but the road to it is full of thorns. My story is a warning and a plea. If you are on the brink of a risky decision, stop. Look ahead and evaluate what you are willing to sacrifice. Sometimes the price is higher than you could ever imagine. The storm had begun before nightfall, covering the sky with a layer of dark clouds that announced the fury that was about to be unleashed. The rain pounded the roof of the cabin with such intensity that it seemed to want to uproot it. Outside, the trees were shaking violently, their twisted branches waving like dark hands reaching for the horizon. The darkness was absolute, interrupted only by flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the landscape, revealing a black lake stretching beyond sight, reflecting the chaos of the sky like a broken mirror. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire in the fireplace struggled to keep at bay the cold that crept through the cracks in the windows. I sat by the window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass, distorting the image of the outside world. Each one seemed to carry with it something more than water. A small part of me, perhaps, or some dark memory that haunted me, like a shadow about to swallow me whole. I had rented this cabin in the hope of finding something I had lost years ago. Inspiration, maybe peace, though I wasn't sure what that meant in my life lately. My existence had been a collage of failed attempts to make sense of things, a succession of days that fell apart without a trace, no matter how hard I tried to hold on to them. I was dedicated to writing stories about others, about people who lived and felt. But even that exercise, which had once given me purpose, was beginning to lose all meaning. I felt I was trapped in an endless spiral of doubt and frustration, searching for something I couldn't understand. It was then that I decided that this isolation in the middle of a rainy and cold autumn could offer me something. I didn't know what. but anything would be better than remaining stuck in the void. The first night, the sound of the storm was my only company. The wind whipped hard and the rain pounded on the windows with almost inhuman persistence. I slept little. My thoughts flitted like night birds trapped in a space I could not comprehend. In the darkness of my mind, the most persistent image was of that man. I had not seen him clearly in many years, but every time I closed my eyes, his face half covered by a dark hood would appear before me. I remembered him with frightening clarity. On a rainy night, in the dim light of the street lamps, he approached my father, who lay on the ground, slumped over, his life slipping away in a pool of blood. A knife glinted in his hands. I didn't know him, but his image had stuck in my memory. After all, I had been just a 9-year-old boy when that scene had marked my life forever. That day, my world had fractured. The man had disappeared into the darkness, and my father never opened his eyes again. From then on, I lived trapped between two realities. That of a boy who had lost his father, and that of a man who, unable to understand why, became immersed in a silent obsession to find answers. Years passed, and my life became a sequence of sleepless nights fueled by a single question. Why? No one gave me a satisfactory answer, at least not the one I wanted. Justice failed, as it always does, filing the case without solving it, but I never forgot. For years, every step I took in my life was marked by that obsession, by the need to find the man who had destroyed my world. I searched and searched, relentlessly, immersed in silent investigations that kept me away from everything that could have brought me happiness. Then months ago, an unexpected twist in the investigation revealed something I never imagined. I found his name, Alberto Marquez, an ordinary man, living in a quiet suburb, with a house and a family that suggested nothing of his dark past. He was just a few miles from where I was standing on the edge of the main road. Everything had lined up. I rented this cabin knowing that today, finally, would be the day I would confront him. I didn't know if it was the inspiration I was looking for or something deeper, something darker. The second night, the storm did not let up. The wind was still howling and the rain was pounding hard. I felt restless, my mind continuing to go over the plan I'd laid out. Every detail had been carefully analyzed, from the entrance to his house to the location of the spare key I knew where to find. I had done my homework with precision, as if on a mission. And above all, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I left the cabin in the rain, the water drenching me immediately, but I didn't care. I drove to his house, parking a few blocks away so I wouldn't be seen. The sound of the storm covered my footsteps as I approached her door. There it was, the spare key, right where I had imagined. I entered cautiously, every muscle in my body tensed, my senses alert for any sound. The house was silent, except for the rattling of the wind against the windows. I climbed the stairs slowly, the creaking of the floorboards echoing like a gunshot in my head. Finally, I reached the door to his room. I opened it, and there he was, sleeping. He looked so normal. Older, his hair graying, wrinkles marking his face, but he was still him. My father's killer. My hand trembled as I pulled out the knife I had brought with me. I stood there, watching him breathe, as the rain continued to fall outside. The fury of the wind beat against the window, but my mind was silent, as if everyone had disappeared, leaving me alone with my pain. Then something broke inside me. All the hatred, all the suffering accumulated over the years exploded in an instant of clarity. I could end it. I was so close. But as I looked at him, something new emerged in my mind. The question that had always tormented me, the question that had never been answered, presented itself with terrifying force. What next? I had lived so long with revenge as my only driving force that I didn't know what would be left of me if I carried it out. Would it free me from the pain, or would it only plunge me further into an abyss from which I could no longer climb out? I lowered the knife. I don't know how long I stood there, watching it, as my thoughts spun in circles. Finally, I turned around and walked out of the house. The storm was still roaring, and the rain greeted me again, as if it wanted to wash all the guilt, all the hate, from me. The next day, from the cabin, I called the police. I told them everything I knew without reservation. A few weeks later, Alberto Marquez was arrested. The evidence was enough to link him to my father's murder and other crimes he had committed in his youth. I did not get peace, but I did get something more valuable: clarity. Life is not just about revenge. Sometimes the greatest lesson we can learn is not how to win, but how to let go. True freedom is not in inflicting pain on those who inflicted it on us, but in learning to let go of what keeps us tied to the past. The inspiration I sought came not from a story I made up, but from my own life, from the ability to choose a different path than the one hate had laid out for me. The storm passed, but the cabin remained there, silent, as a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, we can find a glimmer of light. Today, as I look back, I realize that the storms we go through in life are not always to destroy us, but to teach us how to survive. And what truly saves us is not revenge, but the ability to forgive what can never be repaired. Since that January 3rd, I am not the same. I have repeated it so many times in my head that in the end I don't know if I say it because I believe it or because it has been engraved on my skin like an invisible scar that will never go away. My name is Yorman, and what happened that day continues to haunt me, even in the quietest nights, where the rain falls softly like a distant melody, as if the sky was also crying with me. It all started like any other morning, or so I thought. My life seemed to be on track, like a well-oiled clock. I had a girlfriend I loved, a job I enjoyed, and friends who respected me. All around me, everything seemed perfect. I woke up every day with the feeling that I had everything under control. My thoughts revolved around simple yet satisfying goals: growing my career, enjoying the little moments with her, sharing laughs with my friends. Nothing seemed out of place until it all fell apart, like a house built on a foundation of sand. The first encounter with Daniel was during a casual dinner where a group of friends gathered. He was a seemingly simple guy with an easy smile and a look that conveyed confidence. His way of talking, his enthusiasm for sharing stories, made me quickly feel attracted to him. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just another face in the crowd, another friend to add to my circle, but soon he began to stand out. I invited him to my house, introduced him to my girlfriend, let him know my world, as I would any person who trusts another human being. At the time, I didn't see anything strange. Daniel was just a friend, a companion for parties and pleasant conversations, but soon the dynamics changed. It didn't take me long to realize that something strange was going on. Daniel was getting closer and closer to my girlfriend. At first, I took it as innocent. Who doesn't enjoy the company of a friend? But then the little glances, the gestures that seemed natural to me before, began to unsettle me. He would tell me that I was being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about, that my girlfriend just saw him as a friend. And I believed him, as I always believed him. I was a fool. Blind trust is one of the deadliest traps, because when you trust someone with your eyes closed, you don't see the signs, you don't listen to the warnings your gut throws at you. I was blinded by the idea that everything was fine, that there was no reason to doubt, and in the meantime, the damage was already underway. At the same time, my job also began to change. Suddenly, job opportunities that once seemed to come to me with ease began to vanish. Every door I knocked on closed in front of me, while Daniel, without warning, began to stand out. He was receiving unexpected accolades, being considered for positions I once thought would be mine. I couldn't understand it, but Daniel always had an explanation for everything. He told me that I should relax, that things are not always as they seem, that sometimes we have to give a little in order for doors to open. He suggested I take a break from the pressure of work. And as always, I took it as advice from a well-meaning friend. But that was not the reality. What he was offering me wasn't a break. It was the chance for me to fall apart while he stood taller. Every day my world was getting smaller, and at the same time murkier. It wasn't just my relationship that was at stake. My career, my trust in people, my sense of identity, everything was beginning to crack under the weight of his manipulation. Finally, January 3rd came with a storm. The rain was falling as if the sky shared my pain, as if the entire universe was about to reveal something to me that I didn't want to see. I was in the office doing routine tasks when I received a message from my girlfriend. "Sorry, Yorman, Daniel and we need to talk." Those words, so simple, hit me with the force of a fist. Something inside me snapped. I knew what was happening even though I didn't want to accept it. The storm outside was intensifying, and through the window raindrops were falling heavily, as if trying to erase everything that had been. My mind could no longer process what was happening. My coworker, my friend, was in my house with her. He was with the woman I thought I loved, in my place, taking what belonged to me, destroying what I had built over the years. Betrayal doesn't always come with the scream of an explosion. Sometimes it comes subtly, creeping in like a poison until it's too late to remedy. Arriving home that night, I found the apartment silent. The door was ajar, and the air in the place was thick, dense, as if something heavy was floating in the air. I was used to the hustle and bustle of my daily life, but that calm was the calm before the storm. When I walked in, I knew it immediately. There was no yelling, no arguing. There were only the remnants of a relationship that had been wiped out. My girlfriend was gone. All that remained was a torn photo on the floor, a necklace she used to wear, and a letter on the table. The letter read, "The truth is that I never loved you. Everything you did bored me. Daniel has been there for me in ways you never could. I hope you can understand that. I am better off without you." Those words were like a dagger in my chest. My mind couldn't fully comprehend what was happening, but the weight of those words was indescribable. Not only had she left me, but she had done it in a way that crushed me, as if my existence was worthless. The silence in the house hit me with unusual force. There were no screams, no tears, just the emptiness of a betrayal that could no longer be reversed. But the worst was not the letter. The worst came later, when Daniel started sending me messages, bad jokes, disturbing suggestions. It became a game for him, one where I was the victim, the loser. The night I saw him face to face when the rain was falling hard was the last time I felt the presence of that man in my life. The sky seemed ready to wash it all away. The sound of thunder muffled my thoughts, and at that moment, I understood that I could not run away from what had happened. Daniel looked at me with a crooked smile, as if he enjoyed the spectacle he had created. "How do you feel, Yorman?" he asked me, his voice icy, as if it didn't matter in the slightest what I was feeling. "Do you still think this is not your fault?" I couldn't answer. My throat was closed, as if the air itself had stopped. There were not enough words for what I felt. My mind was twisting, searching for some explanation, but there was nothing. Nothing that could justify what had happened. Daniel wasn't just a friend. He was something much more dangerous. He had manipulated everything in his favor. He had played with my emotions and my confidence until he had destroyed me from the inside. His goal was not just to win. His goal was to make me lose everything that had ever meant anything to me. And he had succeeded. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't recognize the person I see. I am no longer the same person I was before January 3rd. The life I knew is gone, vanished by lies and betrayal. Pain, anger, and helplessness mingle inside me, like a turbulent river that I can no longer stop. People ask me how I am, but they cannot understand what really happened. They cannot see what is left of me because I myself am not able to understand it. I have changed. Sadness and anger have become part of me, and I know that, in some way, they always will be. The only thing I can say after all this is never underestimate the ability of others to twist reality. It's not violence that destroys you, it's manipulation. Psychological game playing is far more lethal than any weapon, because you can't see it coming, and by the time you realize it, it's too late. The human mind can be more dangerous than any sword, and sometimes what hurts the most is not what we see, but what we are made to believe.